Morning. We will now resume the meeting. I open this morning session dealing with managing critical internet resources. This topic has been at the center of our dialogue at our forum. I hope we will have a lively discussion. I am looking forward to our discussion about these important issues. They have been a central part of the IGF since its origins in the WSIS, World Summit of Information Society. However, our discussion today will focus on 4 new issues, and I think we can learn a lot. We will hear about the new top-level domain name program operated by ICANN. Let's consider what are the key global public policy concerns of this program. What are the controversial aspects of the program? The transition from IPv6 to IPv4 to IPv6 has been discussed at past IGFs, but as our second topic today, we will think about a new issue, secondary market for IP addresses. This is an issue of global importance and global interest, which takes us to our third topic. One of that is often misunderstood, the upcoming World Conference of International Telecommunication in Dubai. I hope our discussion today will clear up a few misunderstandings, explain the WCIT process, and help us understand what the real impact might be. And the fourth issue is the concept of the enhanced cooperation as described in the Tunis Agreement from the World Summit on Information Society. We will talk about what has been done to date, what more we can do, and the possible role of the IGF. And I would like here to add some information regarding connected with this issue regarding to Azerbaijan. The most important thing is the these resources of IPv6, and I would like to let you know that a year ago our main backbone provider, Delta Telecom, which almost 80% of the internet traffic of the country, they finished full migration from IPv4 to IPv6, and they're working with the second-tier providers, and some of them already made this transfer. But okay, and this will be maybe question and subject of discussion, that this process can be take too long time, and maybe will not finished forever. Yeah. So this is the question. This is the things which we are discussed today, and I hope we all will be very active, and our remote users will provide interest to these issues, which is very, very interesting for all internet society. Now, I would like to introduce our moderators and turn session over to them. Let me introduce our 2 moderators, Mr. William Drake, University of Zurich, Switzerland, and Chris Dispain, CEO of AU Domain Administration Limited, AU Domain Administration Australia, who will lead us for the rest of the session. We also have a remote moderator, Kathy Handley, from the North American Internet Registry, ARIN, who will introduce comments and discussion and questions from our remote participants. Chris, Bill, Kathy, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I hope you can all hear me. I can hear myself, so I guess that's a good sign. Good morning, everybody. My name is Chris Despain. Welcome to the Critical Internet Resources session. I'm going to do a very brief introduction, and then I'm going to throw you into the hands of Bill, who will lead the first topic. Just so you know, we have a long panel here. I'm going to introduce them in a second. It's not intended that every one of these panelists is going to speak on each one of the topics that we are going to discuss today. If that happened, there would be no time for questions and comments from the floor. Those of you who have been to the Critical Internet Resources session at an IGF before will know that part of the joy of this session is that we get you to talk and contribute. So we'd very much like you to do that, and remotely, as our chairman said, if you're participating remotely, Kathy will be able to fill us in on your comments. So I'm going to go down the line here and introduce you to people. I'm taking my computer because I'll forget people's titles if I don't. I'm starting at this end with Jeff Houston. Morning, Jeff. Jeff is the Chief Scientist of the Asia Pacific Network Information Center, or APNIC. Next to Jeff is Milton Mueller, who's a professor at Syracuse University School of Information Studies and a partner in the Internet Governance Project, and from the US. I was about to say that the next to Milton is Fiona Alexander, who's the Associate Administrator for the Department of Commerce's National Telecommunications and Information Administration Office from the Government of the United States of America. Then we have from Brazil, Ambassador Benedicto Fonseca Filho, who is the Director of the Department for Scientific and Technical Themes of the Government of Brazil. Henriette Esterhuizen, who's the Executive Director of the Association for Progressive Communications from South Africa. Alice Munya, who's the Chair of the Kenya Internet Governance Steering Committee, Ministry of Information and Communications from Kenya. Everybody knows Alice, surely. David Gross, who's a partner at Wiley Rain, Chair of the US CIB ICT Committee and a former ambassador from the United States of America. I'll skip over Chengetai and our chairman because you all know who they are already. Luigi Gambardella is the chairman of the Executive Board of the European Telecommunications Network Operators from Belgium. And finally, but by no means leastly, Pedro Viega is Professor of Computer Networks at the University of Lisbon and the President of the Portuguese Foundation of the National Scientific Computation in Portugal. And finally, my co-moderator, Bill Drake. Bill, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Chris. We are going to begin today's extravaganza of 4 topics. I've just discovered that I'm on the French translation. 1 second. Am I here now? Yes, that sounds like my voice. Good morning, everybody. We're going to start off our extravaganza by talking about the new GTLD program in ICANN. This has been a subject of some great discussion, a lot of mobilization of energies and attention all around the world, and there's been some controversy as well, and so we thought we would try to open the session with a little discussion of the nature of those controversies pertaining to the applications that have been received in the first round for new GTLDs. To do that, we'll spend about 40 minutes or so, 45 minutes on this, and we would like to have enough time for you to participate as well, so perhaps about 30 minutes or so with the panel, a little bit more. I'd like to start out by asking perhaps Milton Mueller could give us a little brief overview to get everybody on the same page as to what the status is of the new GTLD program, where we are with the application process, the character of the applications received, and so on. So why don't we start there? Milton, could you?
Thanks, Bill. Can everybody hear me all right? So let's begin by simply explaining what do we mean by a new TLD, for those of you who don't know. The top-level domain is the farthest to the right part of a domain name, so you've probably heard of .com, you've heard of your country code .cn or .pt for Portugal. These are all top-level domains, and we realized many years ago that really you can put as many names in the top level as you could in the second level, although you may not want to do that. And there are many people who wanted to propose or offer new top-level domains that weren't currently available. People have had the idea that you could have a top-level domain for .music, for example, or you could have top-level domains in scripts of different languages, such as Chinese, Korean, or Cyrillic. So, for 6 years, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, ICANN, developed policy in its generic name supporting organization as to how we should go about adding these new top-level domains. And while technically this process is very simple, there are a lot of policy issues regarding trademark rights protection, free expression for what can you actually say in the new top-level domain space, geographic and country names, who should own them or control them, how do you decide among competing applications, how much do you charge these people to have a top-level domain, how should you license them, what kind of requirements should you place on them. And then there's the issue of the role of the Governmental Advisory Committee in reviewing the names and either vetoing them or censoring them. So after finally working out most of those issues and several attempts to push us back to the starting point again, we have now actually received applications. The applications were revealed this summer. There were actually 1,930 different applications for 1,409 different top-level domain names, or strings as we call them. Only 6% of these were internationalized domain names, or what should be more properly called multilingual domain names. The names proposed ranged from .lol to Chinese and Korean .idns to .app and .book. Interestingly, .app was the most desired top-level domain with over 13 applicants going for it. Now, currently, we are in a period of public comment on the applications, or that may have closed recently, but you could look at all of the applications and express your opinion about them. And the Governmental Advisory Committee of ICANN is also looking over these and issuing what they call early warnings, which sounds ominous, but simply means that some GAC members may not like what they see and that they may get into trouble with the GAC later on down the road. And as far as I know, that's pretty much where we are. There's a lot more technical and detailed things, but I think that's enough to get started.
Thank you, Milton. One of the first questions I suppose we might want to ask is the notion of expanding the TLD space in part is driven by the desire to broaden international engagement in the GTLD marketplace. And one has to wonder whether that has been effectively achieved. One of the points that have been raised by a number of critics of the GTLD program is that when you look at where the applications have come from, there's a certain amount of geographical concentration. And so the question becomes, are we succeeding in bringing in the developing world in particular to the GTLD marketplace? And if not, what more could be done? I believe there was a program established in ICANN to provide support for needy applicants to be able to afford the fees to apply. And I believe we only had 3 applicants for that program. So it seems that there's an issue of outreach here. And so one of the questions that sometimes is asked, both within the ICANN community and in the wider world, is, well, what's going on in terms of broadening participation? Would somebody on the panel like to address that point? Perhaps Alice? Is this something that, coming from Africa, is this a point, and being a former vice chair of the GAC, is this a point that perhaps is close to your heart?
Thank you, Bill, and thank you, everybody. Great pleasure to be on this panel. Yes, it's a concern. It's been a concern for many of us from the Africa region. We only had 17 applications coming from the African region, and I think 24, 27, I don't have the exact figure now, coming from the Latin America and Caribbean region. So in terms of creating that level of diversity, I think there's a challenge there, obviously. The GAC has been on record, actually, advising and urging ICANN to increase the level of outreach and awareness in developing countries, and we could see that hadn't been done effectively and efficiently enough by just the numbers. But then again, I can't place the blame completely on ICANN, really, because when you look at, for example, the Africa region, I think we've been dealing with completely different issues, and I think having that level of participation in terms of applying and getting more GTLD applications coming from the region was not going to be happening at this time, because for the last 4 or 5 years we've been dealing with issues of connectivity and access. And so this is when we're beginning to, now I think we feel that we've actually got to a point where we're having more of us using the internet, and perhaps in the next rounds we may be able to see many more applications. And there's a lot of efforts currently now taking place. Like, we have an African working group that's working on an African strategy, and one of the strategic objectives is to increase the registrars in Africa and to increase the possibility of more applications in the second round. But what was disappointing actually was also the Jazz Working Group realizing that there were only 3 applications after so much hard work that the GAC had put into it.
That would be the applicant support.
The applicant support group, and then having just 3 of them, and the 3 applications were actually what I would call ICANN insiders. So that also, I hesitate to call it a failure, but challenge as well. That we really do need to look at, going forward.
Right. No, I wouldn't be adding editorial words like blame or failure or anything like that. I'm simply asking to characterize the situation at the outset, because it's a question that has been raised by many observers. Maybe we could talk for a second. You said that the Africans are focused on other matters. So what are the barriers? Why have we not gotten more participation from the developing countries and from the non-Western world in this first round? Does anybody have any? Mr. Ambassador, would you have a view on this?
Thank you. I'd like to add some words, maybe not the same vein that was just expressed by Alice, and which I think it's very interesting from the point of view of a GAC member. What I would say from the start is that our assessment is that this decision to adopt this large number of GTLDs is not a response to a demand from developing countries. So I think maybe the easiest answer why there was not so much overwhelming response is that this did not meet the demand. This did not meet something that was being requested from. So I would say, and I'm speaking, of course, as a government representative, I do not have the ambition to speak on behalf of other stakeholders, although I know their positions, is that our initial reaction was negative. We did not think, and we still do not think, there was a need to enlarge the number of GTLDs. The decision being made, we are engaged in the process, and we will do, according to the procedures, we will engage. But we are still convinced this was not the right step. I think this takes us to the larger question that I think is one of the issues you have raised. Does this entail a larger question? I think yes. I think this shows that the multi-stakeholder approach we are aiming at it still has to be refined. We are not looking in regard to the government's role in ICANN to veto or to censor anything. We are more than willing to work with other multi-stakeholders, but on a more equal basis. I as part of a government, and I feel the same sentiment is shared by a number of other governments. We feel rather excluded from the decision-making process. I think there might be some further. I think this is not the right moment. I think ICANN has been going through some changes that point to the right direction, but not in the speed and to the extent we'd like. But we would visualize an organization in which governments would have a say, which is not the case today. We are engaged in a process we did not initiate, we did not agree to, but we are engaged. So I do not have the exact numbers of applications that came from my region. I think probably they will be a little higher than Africa. We are supporting some of those. For example, the one that was proposed by the mayor's office in Rio de Janeiro, .Rio, we are in support of that. As we are, of course, in support of .London that is proposed by the mayor's office of London. We have some concerns in regard to other TLDs that are being proposed, like .Amazon, and we share the concern for South Africa in regard to .Zulu, .Patagonia. I think those names should be not for grabs by some individual organization. So we are engaged in the process, but I think the basic point is that this does not meet a demand on the part of developing countries. I'm sorry, I think I'm speaking too much, but I've been listening a lot, and this message is being heard by me, and I will convey this, that we should, as government, not rush into decisions that will impact on others. But on this case, it was the other way around. We were overrun by a decision, and now we are trying to address, but it was not our demand. It does not answer one of our needs.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. You've actually raised quite a few issues, some of which we'll return to later of a broader character. I just wanted to finish on this point. Maybe David Gross, you are a close observer of this arena. What do you think really are the reasons why, as the ambassador suggests, there wasn't enough demand, perhaps, in other parts of the world? Are there barriers that we can look to eradicate soon? Should we be reasonably content with this first round in terms of what we've got in terms of the spread? What's your view on this?
Well, thank you very much. And first of all, it's a great pleasure to be here on this panel and to be here in Baku. So I thank our hosts very much for this opportunity. Let me answer the question in a slightly different way, if I may, which is, I think the experience, we now have a lot of data that we did not have before. And I think it is useful for everyone to step back and analyze what we're actually seeing in a marketplace way in terms of the demand, the geographic issues, the cost issues, the interest expressed, which I think it's fair to say in some respects was greater from some quarters than had been expected. And I think this is an opportunity for everyone to some degree to take a breath and to try to understand better, which is, I think, the focus of your question, to try to understand better. Are there barriers that are worthy of eradication? Or is it the marketplace telling us there isn't sufficient interest regardless of barriers? I don't know the answer to this. I think Alice's comments were particularly instructive on this. So I think there's a lot to be analyzed, a lot to be learned from this. And I look forward to trying to understand, as I think everyone is, better what is it we should be doing going forward, what lessons are learned, what actions should be taken.
Thank you very much. Well, I think that efforts certainly were made to do outreach, but obviously more will have to be done. But in any event, there are clearly a lot of considerations in different markets as potential entrants consider whether or not they want to bother to go for it. And obviously, in this case, in the first round, this first experience, those players that were already fairly primed and aware and had the resources ready to go were the ones to jump first. And this is not entirely surprising, and one expects that as we go forward, further progress will be made in this regard. Let's turn from the question of distribution to the reactions. You've seen in the wider press environment and in the responses of some governments, views expressed that some of the strings that have been applied for are controversial and raise social, cultural, political concerns that they find rather problematic. And so I'd like to perhaps focus our attention on that. There's been a lot of discussion in the mass media on these kinds of questions. For example, concerns have been raised about strings that have broad meanings, like, say, for example, .book, where, in particular, when an applicant has a closed or exclusive use kind of business model. Some people say, well, maybe this is not consistent with the public interest. This is a privatization of the use of words and so on. Others say, no, that's not really a legitimate concern. As I look down the row, I'm thinking, Milton, would you have a view on that topic?
Well, I do. I have a view of that. Let me tell you, I'm teaching a class in information policy with graduate students, and I tried to get them interested in this issue. So if you take somebody with a completely clean mind who's not deeply involved in the ICANN space, and you say to them, should somebody be allowed to register a generic name in the top-level domain space like .book, they kind of look at you and say, well, why not? What's the problem there? And then you try to explain to them why this is controversial in the ICANN context. And there's actually no way to explain that without pointing out that under the old system you had a class of registrars who had guaranteed access to register names in names like .com or .org. And these registrars want to maintain that guaranteed access to these generic terms. In other words, this isn't really about, dominance of the language or anything like that. It's about business model competition. It's about whether you're going to have different business models in the namespace. So let's just take a generic term like snarky professors. All right. Suppose I wanted to register snarky professors, and I wanted to control who got names in that space, and I put up $185,000 and spent another $1 million to actually get an application through ICANN. Who's to say that that's wrong? Okay, what's the big deal? Now, obviously, I'm somewhat trivializing the issue a bit. Let's be more serious and let's talk about .book. Okay, there are various ways you could run .book. You could simply have an open namespace in which anybody can register who gets there first. And that's when you get all kinds of trademark problems, and you get all kinds of who gets to say, who gets to register Harry Potter? Is it book retailers, or is it the author, or is it this, or is it that? So all you do when you have these more restricted approaches to the top-level space is that you internalize these problems. You give the person who registered the name the right to decide, we're going to manage the namespace this way, and we're going to try to maximize its value by running it in that way. And I think that's actually a good thing, to have competing business models, some of them open, some of them restricted and closed. I don't see any monopoly power issue here. In other words, I don't think anybody monopolizes the market for books simply by controlling the top-level domain .book. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Milton. But still, I have to wonder, those clean-minded students of yours who've never been involved in ICANN, it's one thing to talk about the registrars and competition between business models, but there are others who've expressed interest who are not registrars. There are others who have expressed interest, for example, in civil society, and particularly I've heard in developing countries, a number of people expressing concerns that somehow they see this as a change in a kind of privatization of a linguistic common heritage. You hear that kind of argument. You're shaking your head, but there are others who believe that it could be a concern. Henriette, coming from South Africa and being deeply involved with civil society, have you heard concerns expressed about these kinds of issues?
I think yes, but maybe I'll speak from the perspective of one of Milton's students, and as a librarian, which is my training. And it seems to me that what has evolved in ICANN and is expressed by this GTLD process is a kind of distorted demand and supply relationship. It's where the supply of tools that should ease access to information in the public interest has kind of become driven not by making information more readily and logically available, but by competition for names that are perceived to hold riches for those who own it and who can resell it. So there is a certain lack of logic in that for me, and I'm not sure that and this is the librarian in me, that a process of making information more fairly and equitably accessible belongs in the marketplace. I like Milton's idea. I think there's space for mixed business models, and I think competition between business models is good, and it enriches both the sort of public interest oriented ones as well as the profit oriented ones. But I think completely losing that fundamental principle that the internet and domain names are there to make it easier for people to access information needs to be considered from a public interest perspective. If earlier classification systems like Dewey Decimal or Library of Congress were developed driven by an open marketplace competition process, they would have looked very different. And I know technology is very different, but I think humans still relate to information and process and access information in very similar ways.
Okay. I think that it's fair to say, okay, Mr. Ambassador, you would like to get on it. And let me say also to the other panelists, if you have something you'd like to add quickly, if I didn't look at you on a point, just give me a little indication. Mr. Ambassador.
Oh, thank you. What I'd like to comment is that I think if, to most people I know, if the kind of question was framed the way it was framed by Müller, the answer would be the opposite. People would be surprised that someone would be entitled to exert the monopoly on some top LD. I think one interesting approach we took in the Human Rights Commission was that what is going on offline should go more or less online. So it is very, I think, it's not realistic to think that in the real world someone on a worldwide basis would be entitled to hold monopoly on book or hotel. So it's rather surprising from people that are not involved and are not in the business of this. And I think this is a matter that encompasses other issues than exclusively the business models. It has to be looked into not only from a business perspective. I think one of the challenges when we are dealing with a multi-stakeholder approach is not to let the process be hijacked by one of those perspectives. I think one of the important things in this regard, from the point of view, is we do not see really the meaning. I think I'm listening to what is being said. I think it's very important, but from the perspective of a country that also supports the notion of open data, open government, it's rather a perspective that is not exactly favored by us. But as I have said, we are participating fully, we are engaged in the process, and we look forward to what is being decided upon on those issues.
Part of what you just said that resonates with me a little bit is people who are not involved in the process. Those of us who are involved in the process may feel that, well, we've spent years developing this whole procedure, and there's a way in which people can go about filing objections to strings, and this is all very structured, and it will be taken into account in a very transparent manner, etc. But for those who are not participants in the ICANN process and are not particularly aware of what's going on, they wake up later and find out that, oh, this word has become the property of so-and-so, and some then express a concern. I don't know if there's anything one can do about that. The fact that some parties are not aware of or participating is not easily overcome immediately. I see Milton feeling a little bit agitated on this point, so I'm going to go back to him, and I also want to ask Jeff Houston, who's a close observer of these matters, whether he has a view.
Yeah, I just want to clarify the business about having a monopoly on a word or owning a word. That's not what's going on here. That's simply an incorrect way of framing the issue. If I register a .book I have an exclusive assignment of the TLD string .book. That doesn't mean that you can't use the word book. It doesn't mean that police break into your store if you put book on the front of it. It doesn't mean that you can't register the word book in Spanish or 16 or 27 other languages. And what I have to also make clear here is that exclusive registrations are an inherent part of the domain name system. You have to make an exclusive assignment of the string to somebody. So we're not debating whether somebody has a monopoly on it. Monopoly power means a level of exclusivity that simply doesn't exist merely by registering a name. It does give you a technical exclusivity. And finally, let me point out that these generic words were registered at the second level. Basically, when .com was the only thing, it was almost the default route, there was a book.com. There was an Amazon.com. Now, it's interesting that the ambassador thinks that a private company should not get that, but maybe a government should have a monopoly on it because the Amazon River flows through their territory. I'm not sure what his position is on that, but I just think we have to not confuse the exclusive assignment of a domain string with economic or political monopoly power. That is simply not a correct way to do things.
Jeff, what do you think about that?
Is this all a case of search engine denial? Because, quite frankly, folk don't use the domain name system to find out things. They use search engines. And domain names strike me as the horse and carriage of the car industry. Honestly, these days, all they are tokens that you use once you've found what you've found. And I don't actually think they convey much. Unlike a Twitter message, which has at least 140 characters, domain names are shorter than that and are generically useless. They don't actually convey any information. And it always surprises me that such an amazingly large industry has sort of started up around a system whose real utility has come and gone. That search engines these days are what you really should be wondering about. And search engines really are the underlying issue of why is my content visible or not visible? And interestingly, governments have let search be the property of private industry now for over a decade and have never really looked at the underlying issues of to what extent that search function has relatively vast economic implications, yet we're happy to spend millions upon millions of dollars mucking around with domain names. Perhaps domain names are simple and easy, and that's why we love to spend so much time and fascination on them. But honestly, they don't do much. Search is everything out there. Domain names are just vanity labels.
So are you suggesting that after spending all of this money launching a TLD, the value of the TLD to any given applicant might be reduced by the number?
Well, I find it pretty weird that the whole system around generic names was an outcome of the failure of .us. And then almost every other country had just quite neatly aligned their domain names underneath a top-level country domain name and figured out internally, yeah, we can sort things out. And then to suggest somehow that we need more generic top-level domain names and then assert unilaterally that the rest of the world needs them too, seems to be a little bit of assertion of demand without the substance. And then to say, well, the other countries didn't follow along. Maybe they're missing out on something. I would suspect that the other countries didn't follow along because maybe they understood something, and that realistically, generic top-level domain names is not the saviour of tomorrow's internet. It's irrelevant.
Thank you, Jeff. That was suitably provocative. There have been other kinds of names that also have been subject to some controversy or concern. Fiona, for example, concerns have been raised about regulated industries like financial industries and so on, where there's the possibility of consumer protection questions, etc. Do you have any thoughts on those kinds of questions? I know in the Government Advisory Committee, questions have been raised around regulated industries and the names pertaining to them.
I can't tell if it's better to keep this on or off. Well, I think maybe perhaps some historical framing is useful. This is not the first time there's been an expansion of the top-level domain name space. By my count, this is the third time. And my recollection of the history of this system was one of the founding principles of ICANN was to actually introduce competition in the domain namespace by introducing new TLDs. So I'm a little bit at a loss as to Jeff's view about the failure of .us, but this could predate my time a little bit. So again, I think it's important. This is not the first time this has happened. I think this is the first time it's happened in this way, in this many. And I think what you're seeing is the consequences of previous rounds and the way that ICANN went about doing it, concerns that those weren't effective, the 6-year policy-making process leading to the results we have today, which different people can argue aren't perfect, but it's where we've gotten to as a stakeholder community and has agreed is the way to go forward. And what we've got right now is each of the stakeholders having an opportunity to express views, whether it's public through the public comment process, which is, I think, closed now, or governments through the 2 tools that are available to them, which is to express their individual government early warning through the GAC, which, again, the purpose of the early warning is to let applicants know governments may have a problem. There's a possibility in some cases of remediating that application, in particular with geographic names. And then the subsequent process, which will be in the April timeframe, is a GAC consensus objection, which presumably, if the GAC as a consensus says this shouldn't go forward, will not go forward. So that's the whole process as a whole. And I think what you're seeing, and I wouldn't want to speak for the GAC as a whole, but what you're seeing in the GAC is different governments going through their own internal processes. In the United States, we run a monthly DNS interagency meeting, and we went through the applications, all 1,930 as a government, to figure out what strings and what applications we may or may not have concerns with in anticipation of participating in the early warning process, the results which will be out, I think, November 20th or 21st. So I don't want to speculate on what people would or wouldn't do, but I think it's fair to say that governments have concerns about consumer protection, consumer fraud, and consumer harm. And anytime you're changing something, I think governments want to make sure there are protections in place. But I do think it's important not to lose sight of the purpose of the program at the outset. And people can be disappointed in the results of who applied and who didn't apply, and I think that's a fair question and one that will need to be addressed in the review of this program. But I do think the fact that you had 1,930 applications with a significant number of companies and a significant number of money means that someone somewhere believes there's a business model. Perhaps Jeff doesn't, but there's a business model in some cases. And in other cases, the TLDs have particular uses for communities. So I think if you look across the applicants, there's not one purpose for each of these TLDs. Each TLD tends to have a different purpose depending on who's applied. So I think it's hard to talk about them in the abstract as well.
Okay, that's why I was asking you a concrete question, which was pertaining to regulated industries. What are the specific concerns that governments might have with regard to applications pertaining to regulated industries?
So I think governments collectively will want to make sure that any string that purports to represent a regulated industry has appropriate consumer safeguards in place. Now, what those safeguards may be or need to be may be different from country to country perspective and may be different from sector to sector perspective. And those are issues that the GAC is grappling with, as in Toronto, and will be grappling with going forward. And Alice actually participates in the GAC more directly than I and could speak to that probably more specifically. But that's the set of issues that they're discussing.
Okay, thank you. We'll return in a second to the GAC and more generally the process of reviewing them. I just wanted to get out on the table some of the concerns that have been expressed about the types of strings. One other that we've heard some expressions of concern about, well, actually two perhaps, geographic related and also those that have potentially religious or cultural salience. There have been a number of expressions. We saw, for example, I believe it was Saudi Arabia objected to a rather large set of applications and said a number of these had raised cultural concerns about appropriateness and so on. Would anybody like to speak to those kinds of questions? Or I can just ask Alice if she would like to help me address that question. Or somebody from the audience? Are you pointing with a reason?
I'm pointing to our GAC chair, Heather. Who's
okay. Well, we will certainly want to get Heather in on the conversation in a second.
Yes, the GAC is actually considering whether the applicant guidebook has sufficient provisions for public policy issues, and some countries are going to be looking at beyond, consumer protection issues, but also strings with the religious terms that don't have the support from the relevant organizations or community, geographic names that don't have support from the governments as well as obviously strings that have multiple meanings. Again, that could have geographic connotations, and at the same time there's the commercial, But then at this, each member country is doing that at the national level before we come to the level where the GAC offers its advice. So, and we're calling that, of course, early warning, which will allow GAC members to interact, or the applicants to interact directly, and then there's going to be advice on that. Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's talk a little bit more then about. Oh, okay, Mr. Investor, please.
Thank you. I'd just like to refer to our concern in regard to .amazon that was referred by Mr. Miller. Well, first of all, Amazon is not only a river, it's the whole of a geographic region that spans many countries, including Brazil. So we, of course, are objecting that some private institution would own the internet domain. And of course, we are not objecting that any bookstore names itself Amazon, or a hotel names itself Amazon, or any kind of business. But if someone is entitled to uniquely in the internet domain to own a top-level domain, I think this is a problem for us, not only for Brazil, for the whole region. I'd like to just make two comments in regard to other issues that were touched before. One of the barriers, of course, is the cost. And I think this is one of the reasons why there are not so many applications coming from the developing world. This is something that might, I think, have been discussed in this illuminated environment of ICANN and all over the years. By the way, we have been participating actively, not only from the perspective of government, but also we have a very robust civil society, private sector that has been fully engaged in the ICANN. So when I'm speaking as a government and challenging some of the decisions and the process, it's not because of lack of participation, but rather because the points of views did not have the exact place to be considered, and were not duly considered. These were overruled in the process. And I think one of the questions that were asked, and one assumption that was made, is that we need to assign some names to different institutions because this is the way to run things. Is that really a need? Do we need that? From our perspective, the answer is no. Thank you.
All right. Well, why don't we talk a little bit then about what is the process by which the objection and evaluation takes place then? We've got we've got 1930, is it? 1930 string applications. They're going to have to be reviewed in the ICANN process. A very elaborate approach has been mapped out for that, and that includes several bases for filing objections by different parties, and includes also a fairly wide scope of possibilities for governments, it seems to me. Governments seem in Toronto, we've learned there's not just advice, but there's also requests and other things. So there's all kinds of ways governments and other parties now can express concerns. Could somebody, perhaps Fiona or Milton, why not Milton? Perhaps you could describe a little bit, just briefly, the range of objection processes and how we'll go about doing these evaluations going forward.
Well, it's a very disturbing process, if you ask me. I think it's basically governments are getting together in a room as the Governmental Advisory Committee, and they are basically making or trying to make international law, enforceable international law, enforceable through ICANN and its control of the root, without going through a democratic process. They're saying this is the advice of the GAC, and basically what that means is that a few of the more active and dominant governments in the GAC are saying that this is what they support and nobody else is objecting. And then they're saying we don't have to pass a text or a rule that actually expresses what we're trying to stop. We're simply going to say we don't like this guy, we don't like this applicant, or we don't like this string. And they don't have to take it back to their national legislatures and get ratification of a treaty. There's no accountability. You don't even know how the different governments voted or stood on this particular issue. So you get an advice. Let's say the GAC decides that they don't like .gay. Okay? Is it illegal to say the word .gay? Obviously not. In fact, in the U.S., it would probably be illegal for the GAC to stop anybody from using that word simply because they didn't like homosexuality. So this is I sort of agree with Jeff Houston that the issues here are not about whether we get this domain or that domain. That's not really very interesting to me. What is extremely interesting to me is the authority of governments over the ICANN process. Because on the one hand, we have the United States and many other Western countries on the warpath about the ITU and the WCIT process because governments are taking over the Internet. And yet, we see the GAC within ICANN asserting more and more authority, now deciding that its advice would have to be overruled by a 2/3 vote of the board, and asserting more and more authority over the top-level domain name process. And I think there's an absolute double standard here, that on the one hand, we're saying governments should not be involved in the governance of the Internet when it comes to the ITU or other institutions, but inside ICANN, we're saying that governments are going to have a kind of arbitrary, yes, it's a veto power. There's no rules that tell you what is allowed and what isn't. It's just they sit around and they say, do we like this or don't we? And that's kind of an arbitrary veto power that doesn't have to be ratified through a democratic legislative process. I think that's more scary than what's happening at the ITU.
So you have a view about this matter, then, is what you're saying. Okay, I think we will definitely have to hear from Heather in a little bit. If I could maybe try to get a few more people in on just on the process of just so everybody's clear how in ICANN the evaluation and objection process will work. It's not a foregone conclusion that all these things go in. Obviously, there's competition between various applications and so on. So how are they being reviewed? David, could you perhaps maybe just briefly illustrate how the review process and the objections, the kind range of objections that applicants can be made to applications, just so people know?
I'm the wrong person for that one on this panel.
You are? Okay, well then Fiona would be the right person.
Yes, oddly, I think that may be the case on this particular panel. So just to keep in mind the timelines, and I won't have the exact dates in front of me because these dates will have shifted most recently, but applications were due in the springtime. The application process is closed. Anybody in the world was able to file public comments on applications that were submitted. There was a request for an extension of the public comment period. ICANN granted that extension, and the public comment process is now closed. Now, the ICANN staff has outsourced to a variety of contractors the review of these applications. So the applications, and my understanding was each application was probably about 300 or 350 pages per TLD by the time you filled it out. Each application has to go through a series of financial and technical checks to make sure that the applicant is actually able to actually run a part of the Internet's critical infrastructure. At the same time, and this is all part of the initial evaluation. Initial evaluation results, I understand, are probably due out in March now of next year, I think is the time frame for that. Also, during this time period, there's an ability for people to raise objections to a TLD. Separate and apart from the GAC process, which Milton has inaccurately described, there's an ability for stakeholders to file objections. I can never remember all four of them, but the two that come to mind are the legal rights objection. So if you are a legitimate trademark holder, you're able to file an objection based on protecting of your mark. There's also an opportunity to file a public interest objection. So based on the public comments, if other people weren't able to actually pay to file the objection, ICANN has hired an independent objector to actually review the public comments and file objections. There's two other vehicles for filing, or methods for filing objections as a stakeholder community. I just can't remember them off the top of my head. Governments, for their role, as I said, have two processes. And this isn't about governments having a veto power. It's about governments having a place inside the multi-stakeholder model. So in this case, it means governments having a role and a voice inside the new GTLD program. So the first vehicle is governments individually being able to express early warnings through the GAC. The second opportunity, which will be in the April timeframe, is governments collectively saying, we think a particular string is not in the public interest, therefore it shouldn't go forward, and then the ICANN board will consider that advice. It's presumed that the ICANN board will take that advice. If, however, they're not going to take that advice, you have to have that bylaw consultation. That's the process as it's laid out. And again, the GAC process is not about vetoing or governments telling people what to do. It's about governments participating in the model. And that's what this is about. You can't have a multi-stakeholder model that doesn't include a role for governments.
Thank you, Fiona. That was very helpful. When you say it is presumed that the GAC advice will be followed, how does one characterize that presumption in relation to the larger questions that are raised around this issue of governance and the role of governments vis-a-vis the multi-stakeholder process?
So I'd refer you specifically to the text in the guidebook, because it actually gives very specific wordings when it describes the role of governments and the government objection process. So if governments collectively have a consensus objection, there's specific wording that the board has agreed to do. So I don't want to misquote that, so it's important to take a look at those words specifically. Okay.
I think we should, at this point, we've thrown enough on the table to start to get audience engagement in the process. So I would invite anybody who would like to address these questions to, do we have microphones? The mics are roaming around? We don't have mics standing in the front. I'd first like to turn to Heather, because if we could, we have I'll come to you, Parminder, after, but we have the chair of the GAC here. Can we get her a microphone to, the microphones are in the back of the room, I'm told. I don't know why that. Yes. Go ahead. Thank you.
Heather, we can't hear you. Sorry, ladies and gentlemen, we're just having a slight technical issue. Still can't hear you. Heather, do you want to come up here? Heather, come up here.
Could somebody test the mic that's over here?
It's okay, I'm going to use this mic here, Bill.
Yeah.
Just while we're waiting for Heather, could I just remind everybody that there is a workshop this afternoon at 4:30 precisely on new GTLDs for those who would like more information. Thank you.
Can you hear me now? Okay, excellent. All right. So now I feel there's more pressure now that I'm up at the front. My name is Heather Dryden. I am chair of the Governmental Advisory Committee at ICANN. I'm also from the Canadian Department of Industry. And thank you for giving me a chance to talk a bit about the Governmental Advisory Committee in a way that will really complement what you've heard from my government colleagues on the panel. And regarding the Governmental Advisory Committee, it has been increasing in its effectiveness. And this is really important because if it's not effective, governments won't participate. So for the multi-stakeholder model to work, it has to be an effective means for governments to influence and advise the board at ICANN. However, it is important that there is balance established between the committee and other parts of the organization, and if there isn't a balancing of influence, then I can see how there might be concerns about that. In terms of the new GTLD process, it's important to remember that the mechanisms that have been described by my colleagues, called early warning and GAC advice, are really the result of extended discussions, advice, consultations about how to address some of the concerns that governments were raising about the process. In fact, this was not the first thing that governments proposed in order to better address some of the concerns about what might be applied for and whether that would really be in the global public interest for those applications and those strings to be introduced into the domain name system. So, to talk a bit about those mechanisms specifically, it's useful to think of the early warning process as being a low bar or a more lightweight signal that governments can provide because they have concerns, and hopefully many of those concerns can be addressed. So that if there is communications with an applicant, and those early warnings, by the way, are going to be published, they will be made public. You will see what are the early warnings that are going to be filed. And November 20th is the date for communicating the early warnings as a whole from the GAC to applicants. So it's as I say, a lightweight process for that. And for those issues that can't be addressed or that aren't going to be addressed, some of those may be proposed by a GAC member for broader discussion within the GAC. But if you are talking about a consensus objection, so we're not talking about voting, we're not talking about vetoing anything, but if you're talking about considering an application for a consensus advice coming from the GAC, in particular an objection, that's really difficult to accomplish in a setting like this. So it's a high bar or a more strict level of agreement needed among governments, and that's deliberate. That's by design, and we think it should be that way. So I think that hopefully will give you some facts about how the process will work.
Thank you, Heather. That's very helpful. So there's a differentiated range of possibilities here in terms of government's responses to these issues. And of course, as was pointed out by Fiona, there are other processes as well for people in the international community to raise concerns about the strings, and there's an elaborate review mechanism established under the applicant guidebook to deal with these kinds of questions. I'd like to take a couple more questions, and then we'll turn to IPv4 markets. I see Parminder is standing up here, and if there's anybody from over here also. Parminder, do you have a mic? And then also we have, Rahul. The mic should go to Parminder?
Yeah, I have got the mic. Thank you, Bill. First of all, I'm Parminder from IT for Change, an NGO based in Bangalore. And I think one thing we should make clear to the audience who may not be very familiar with what kind of problems are we really dealing with here, there's a particular category of new GTLDs which are both private and closed using generic names. And that's the most problematic, and that's the one which has attracted most adverse media and civil society attention. These are GTLDs like .book, .beauty, where not only they use generic names, they can be taken up by a company who would then not allow anybody else or may not allow anybody else to register second level domain names under it. So this is a particular category which is attracting the criticism of privatization of names. And now to the comments from the panelists, I've been arguing with Milton Mueller for a long time, and he says that it's merely a matter of technical exclusivity. It's the same as the second level domain name. Both we do not agree with, and Milton has claimed for a long time that domain names really don't have any semantic meaning, and there are so many people so much exercised by the generic name domain names. They think the companies are going to use this label to kind of exclusively dominate a particular area and has competition issues. However, I would then come to Jeff's comment that domain names are simply not important enough any longer, and Milton kind of approved that approach. But if that is the fact, then should we put domain names out of the critical internet resources bracket and put search engines into the critical internet resources bracket, and we should have sessions on managing and governing search engines here and not really the domain names. And I would very much like to have that approach, and would like to listen to your responses on it. Thank you.
Well, I can see Chris likes that idea, but Raul, could you share a view with us?
I guess that I can speak in Spanish. Yes,
I presume.
Quería aprovechar esta oportunidad para decir que me parecieron excelentes los comentarios de la colega Henriette Stechorsen. Me parece que no se pueden ver los asuntos de Internet solamente desde la perspectiva del libre mercado, de la libertad de mercado. Me parece que hay que tener en cuenta otros intereses. Los temas de Internet incluyen, por supuesto, este tema de nuevos dominios genéricos. Ver Internet solamente como un mercado donde hay oportunidades de hacer dinero sería una visión muy pobre de Internet. Me parece que justamente lo que tratamos de promover en el IGF es justamente una visión mucho más amplia y lo podemos ver en los contenidos de todos los workshops, las discusiones que tenemos aquí. Por supuesto, innovación, inversión, emprendimiento son cosas muy importantes y tenerlas en cuenta, pero también hay que tener en cuenta que esto es mucho más y por lo tanto me parece que no hay que ver solamente los intereses de las personas o las organizaciones que pretenden hacer dinero con ciertas reglas de libre mercado, lo cual es muy aceptable, pero también hay que tener en cuenta todos los demás intereses que se han expresado aquí y muchos más que seguramente tienen otros stakeholders. Gracias.
Thank you, Raul. I think that point of taking all interests into perspective and having a process that's inclusive is a good one to end on for this particular topic. Look, can we just briefly, because we need to move on to IPv4 markets?
Absolutely, Mr. Chair. I will be as brief as possible, but I'd like not to leave some of those things unanswered. First of all, I'd like all my comments to be seen from the perspective of a representative of a country that practices, not only preaches, but practices multi-stakeholderism, that believes in IGF, that believes in the institutions that run internet governance. And we do not by any means looking at initiatives to curtail the activities of any of those institutions. So I think this is the basic framework in which my comments I'd like to be seen. First of all, and secondly, I think it's not helpful if some of the comments I made, some attempts to disqualify the comments, for example, resorting to assumptions such as that only the US and Western countries are working in the ITU to prevent intergovernmental control. This is not the case. My country, we also have, as my colleague yesterday said, we are still preparing a position for the ITU meeting, but our approach is more or less conservative in the sense that we want it to be in line with the Constitution. We do not want it to expand beyond its boundaries. So I think it's not just accurate and it's not fair to say that only the US and Western countries are concerned about some of these aspects. Finally, I'm sorry, I'd like to say that I think this has already been touched by Fiona and Heather in regard to the GAC procedures. But I'd like also to say that the approach my country takes to the exercise within GAC is not the one as was described. It's not an authoritarian approach. We want to, if we issue early warnings or we participate in the consensus, we feel it needs to be fully informed in a way that would entail an endorsement, not because of the authority of the GAC, or because it has none, it has not a decision-making power, but because its arguments will be heard and agreed at. So this is basically the approach we are taking toward this exercise. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. And where you're coming from is, I think, understood by everybody, so there's no problem with that. Okay, this is obviously a big topical area that we're only scratching the surface on, but we wanted to get it on the agenda for this main session. Now we turn to another important and controversial matter, and I hand over to my co-monitor here.
Thank you. Thank you, Bill. And just to repeat, it is an interesting topic, and there is more discussion to be had on UGTLDs. And there are a number of workshops happening during this week, including one this afternoon at 4:30. So if you want to know more, if you want to ask more questions, then please do come along. 1 second. We're going to It's really quite hard to actually talk and hear yourself at the same time, so I take my headset out. We're going to move on now to IPv4 and IPv6 addresses and secondary markets. A topic that those of you who have been around for a long time will know that the Critical Internet Resources session at the IGF has always had a section on this. Remarkably, on this particular occasion, we have Axel and Paul and Raoul and various other people from the RIRs in the room, none of them are up here on this panel. But I suspect that we might call on them at some point. Jeff, would you be prepared to just very briefly introduce the topic of IPv4, IPv6 and explain for those who don't necessarily understand?
Thank you. Yes, I'm Jeff. I'm from APNIC, one of the regional internet registries. So, yes, you know, we're not running out of domain names soon. There seems to be an infinite supply of names, and quite frankly, anyone that actually argue the last domain name is going to be registered next week would be kind of silly. But you can't say the same about the fundamentals below that, which is actually the addresses. Because for the internet itself, it doesn't negotiate names as packets move through the network. It negotiates IP addresses. So every service, no matter what it is, if it's a public service, it needs an IP address. Now, when the internet was first designed, and this is going a long time back, the original address space used was 32 bits. At the time, the world was full of mainframes, and there were a few thousand of them. So to use 32 bits was considered to be crazy talk. Other protocols at the time used 16 bits, and they thought that was just fine. 65,000 mainframes would cover most of the surface of the planet. The idea that you had 32 bits and 4.3 billion possible addressed devices just seems incredibly large. But you and I now know that computers are the size of inside your pocket. Computers are now single chips that sit inside your passport. Computers are literally everywhere, and most of them want to talk. Most of them want to communicate one way or another. So it's now no surprise that those 32 bits are looking not just finite, but in some cases we have run out. Addresses were centrally managed by the Internet Assigned Numbers Authority, IANA. They administered blocks of addresses, where each block is 16.7 million addresses, what we call a /8. Its last blocks were handed out into the RIR system in February of last year, 2011. In the RIR that services the Asia-Pacific area, APNIC, we handed out our last conventional address in April of last year, April 2011. That doesn't mean addresses are completely unavailable, but the policy we're now using inside that region is far more restrictive, and each and every applicant can get at most 1,024 addresses forever. That's it. The RIPE NCC that services Europe and the Middle East has now encountered exactly the same situation, and their available pools of address space are now down to their final block as well. That happened in September of this year. So they are also now down to a policy of at most 1,000 addresses to any person. The other RIRs in the North American area, ARIN, AFRINIC in Africa, of course, and LACNIC in Latin America and the Caribbean, over the next 2 years we expect them to run out. The run-out projections vary slightly, but it's basically a here and now problem. The theory was that we were going to all use IPv6. This is an address protocol that has 128 bits of address space. Enough addresses, as someone said, if they're all grains of sand, you could not only construct the Earth, but another 300 million planets like it. It's a huge address space, but we're not using it. About the most optimistic metric one could give of IPv6 penetration in the world today is still under 1%. That realistically, when we try and measure the amount of IPv6 out there, we're calibrating our measurement instruments down about as finely as we can to detect this. So we're in this paradoxical situation where we have a network that is just growing out of control. Last year, I believe, we hooked up more than 800 million devices, a lot of them mobile smartphones, but many other devices as well. The address space only grew by 150 million. So most of those devices sit behind various forms of network translating units and similar. But the amount of IPv6 last year grew by a much lower amount. So somehow we're managing to drive ourselves into a rather strange situation in this world, where the old transparent end-to-end internet is no longer clearly evident in much of the internet, and a drive to use an address space that would restore that transparency isn't really being picked up by industry.
Thank you, Jeff. Pedro, would you just why are we not using IPv6?
Well, thank you, Chris. I don't have a clear question, a clear answer to your question, but I will try to describe my affiliation with IPv6 that began in the beginning of the 90s. I was following, as you mentioned initially, I am a professor at university, but I have other roles that are more related to your question. I began following the crisis of IPv4 and the initial work on what was called by that time IPNG, IP Next Generation. So it was understood that IPv4 was going to last only a few years, and we arrived to IPv6 that has been just described. We began shortly after doing some academic work. I had a student that wrote one of the first implementations of IPv6 in the Linux kernel. And shortly after, I have been appointed to manage the Portuguese Research and Education Network. And my initial temptation was to put IPv6 in operation. It was not easy. The products were not in the market. But one of the critical dates was 2003. In 2003, the European Research and Education Networks had already a lot of experience, and the network was running both protocols. So it's what's technically called dual stack. We could run IPv4 and IPv6 in the core network. But I have another role. The other role that I have is I manage the top-level domain of Portugal. And also to prepare our infrastructure for IPv6, we updated our information system to allow IPv6 glue records, so that the user, in addition of putting to a given domain name the IPv4 address of the server, put the IPv6 address. Now, after this happened in 2004, now 8 years after, the number of users putting their IPv6 address there is rather short. There is not a motivation that I will try to cover later on. At the same time, more or less, the European Union created an IPv6 task force. There were some political documents stating that the European industry should move forward for IPv6. The task force basically vanished after a few years. What's happening now, and trying to answer to your question. The ISPs in my country, we are a medium-sized country, but we have a good deployment of broadband in cable, fiber, wireless. Today, the ISPs are still installing in the premises of the customers IPv4 only routers. When I contact them to know the reason, they say the routers that support IPv4 and IPv6 are expensive, are more expensive than the other ones, and they want to delay the investments. Maybe now that, as we heard, the IPv4 address space is being exhausted, there will be an incentive for them. But the market is trying to delay investments the more that they can. I would like to finalize with something. In 2008, our Research and Education Network was wishing to do a public tender to connect some institutions, around 400 institutions in the country. And we have to make a public tender. And in the public tender, we discussed internally in the organization if IPv6 should be mandatory or not. But I must confess, we were afraid that if IPv6 was mandatory, there were no valid tenders. So we decided to ask for IPv4, but favor the proposals that had already IPv6. The company that won proposed to have IPv6, but then it was a nightmare, the implementation. Although their core network was prepared, the routers were compliant. The problem with their technical staff. They had many difficulties in but basically the market is very slow because they have to invest some resources in training staff, in buying maybe slightly higher equipments, and they want to delay that.
Thank you. Okay. So my understanding, and I'm not an expert on this, but my understanding is that although IPv4 addresses have been distributed, there are a significant proportion or number of those IPv4 addresses that are not actually used. And one of the topics that we were going to discuss today was the emergence of a secondary market, where somebody who was given a bundle of IPv4 addresses many years ago can now create a market in those addresses and sell them, thus maintaining the ability to continue to use IPv4 for longer. Does anyone on the panel, Milton, would you like to have a crack at addressing that before I move on to someone else? Thank you.
Yes. So picking up on the previous speaker, the problem is actually even worse than he suggested, in the sense that even if you implement IPv6, as long as there are a lot of other people out there who have not implemented it, you have to keep running IPv4 in order to remain compatible with them. And so that means that when you're running what they call dual stack, you still need these IPv4 addresses. So it becomes extremely important to put those addresses to the most efficient use. And in the early days of the Internet, before there was a more formalized contractual system for rationing addresses, the address blocks, the number blocks, were basically handed out fairly liberally. And that means that there's a lot of people, especially in the North American region, who have surplus addresses. And for example, before there was such a thing as a business commercial ISP, any organization with a substantial network had to basically run its own internet service provider, and therefore they would request addresses, large number blocks, /16s and so on. And as soon as there were commercial ISPs, they didn't really need those blocks anymore, but they didn't return them because there's no incentive structure in the current system to make them return them. So that means there are a lot, literally over 1 billion, or at least 1/4, maybe 1/3 of the IPv4 address space is actually available for continued use. And because of the slow implementation of IPv6, it's pretty clear that we're going to have to use them. And so the transfer market has been a way to move these resources out of these unused spaces and into places where they need them.
Thank you, Milton. I'm going to go to Jeff and Pedro, but I also want to go to the audience. I know there's at least one person who wants to talk. If you can go and stand by the microphones if you want to talk, I'll wager that Raoul wants to say something too. Jeff, let me start with you.
Certainly, we've run short, while at the same time the foot is firmly pressed on the accelerator of deployment. Last year we added more devices to the internet than we've ever added before, and this year promises to be even bigger. But it's not quite as dire as you think. If you look at your iPhone, if you look at your mobile device, and if it has something like an app that tells you its IP address, more than likely you'll find that the IP address being used is private. That a lot of the growth of the internet is already being absorbed into network address translators. So that even though two very, very large parts of the world have run out of addresses, and we actually do have policies that permit folk to transfer addresses, to buy and sell, we actually haven't seen an awful lot of transactions so far. And don't forget, in the Asia Pacific, it's now about 18 months later. What we do see, which seems quite reasonable as in terms of a response, is that folk are deploying more and more of these carrier-grade NATs, and that folk are indeed working in more and more middleware into the situation, as distinct from trying to buy more addresses. Because if you think about it, there aren't that many addresses compared to how fast we're growing. If we really tried to give everybody a public address, every Mac, every iPhone, every Android, even if we managed to pull in another 1 billion addresses into the pool next year, that would last for 14 months, tops. So a market like that wouldn't really address the needs of an end-to-end transparent network. All it would simply do is just fuel more NAT deployment one way or another. So folk really haven't leapt into the market, I think, because the carrier grade NAT solution has been a more convenient solution at the day.
Thank you, Jeff. Pedro, just quickly, and then we'll go to the floor. Did you want to respond? Yeah, okay.
I have in front of me a message that I received on the 21st of October coming from a company that has an address, ipv4rent.de. It says, "Dear sir, as you might know, the IPv sources are depleting and ISPs all over Europe are affected by the situation. So basically this is a proposal that I rent some of the address space that I'm not using." Right. So this is happening now, and this is very important to discuss. Thank you.
I thought it was going to be a rant, but it turns out it was rent. So, Milton, just quickly, and then we'll go to the floor.
Yeah, I just wanted to provide you with some facts about the growth of the market. It's actually much more extensive than Jeff may have indicated. We recently did a quantitative study of this, and really all of the major RIRs, that is to say Asia Pacific, ARIN, and RIPE, have passed transfer policies allowing these market transfers only in the last 3 years. And APNIC only depleted its free pool in the last year. And in that year, we've seen a growth of a market that is currently valued at least $100 million. And if it continues to grow at its current rate, it would easily reach $1 billion next year. And if it continues at that other rate for another 2 or 3 years, it could easily surpass the domain name industry in market value. So think about all the fights and all the battles we've had about domain name policy, and it's happening because of the money involved. Now translate that into the terms of the IP addressing world, and I think you're going to see major institutional changes in rules and regulations, and changes in industry structure in response to that. So it's really important, and Pedro's comment should be built upon. There's all kinds of new business models being proposed, leasing of addresses, and so on. I think we really need to focus on how to do transfer markets right. I don't think it's the only issue, but it's certainly an important one.
Okay, I'm going to take a comment from the floor in a second, but before I do, I just want you to think about, and those of you who want to comment, think about why should anyone care? What's the first thing I'm going to notice? Not as a person involved in ICANN or in the RIRs or anything, just as a person. What's the first thing I'm going to notice that's going to make this matter to me, even a tiny bit? Because a lot of it is happening in spaces that I don't even understand. Go. We need to have this microphone working, please.
Thank you.
Fantastic.
Paul Vixie, ARIN Board of Trustees. Wanted to put my own stamp on why V6 is not being deployed. It is because it has a significant last mover advantage. Right now the cost, and in recent years the cost of deploying has been high, the benefit of deploying has been low. The reason we connect to the internet is to talk to other people. So there's a huge advantage in being the last person to convert from V4 to V6, because then you'll be able to talk to everybody with V6. So we are, in a sense, all competing to be the last person. That creates a huge population of non-movers. And yes, as Jeff said, there's a lot of carrier-grade NAT and other trickery that's being used. There's also a belief some people have that V6 is not inevitable. So there is the idea that perhaps we will fill the entire routing table with all 32 bits of space accounted for by someone. That turns out to bring perils of its own, because the routing system cannot tolerate the massive deaggregation of the tiny little prefixes that we would get there. So what we have at the moment is 3 unpleasant alternatives that everyone in the world is being asked to select among.
Thank you, Paul. Raul, is that working up there for you?
It's working?
It's working, yeah.
Thank you. Hablaré en español de nuevo. Primero me voy a presentar, no olvidé presentarme la vez anterior. Mi nombre es Raúl Echeverría y soy el CEO de LACNIC, el Registro Regional de Internet para América Latina y parte del Caribe. Tal vez debería repetir aquí mi comentario anterior sobre los riesgos de analizar los problemas de Internet solamente desde la lógica de libertad de mercado, pero ya lo dije antes, pero creo que también aplica a este punto. Se dijo en el panel recién que las direcciones que fueron asignadas y que no están siendo utilizadas serán necesarias. Yo quería corregir este punto porque me parece que no son necesarias. Todavía hay en varias regiones, en los registros menores, probablemente, en las regiones de los registros menores todavía tenemos direcciones IP para solventar el desarrollo de Internet por un tiempo, direcciones IPv4. Pero además aquellas organizaciones que ya han recibido direcciones IPv4 tienen estrategias para poder hacer su transición a IPv6 y estar conectados a los dos mundos utilizando las direcciones que ya tienen. Y hay políticas en todos los registros regionales para asegurar por un buen largo tiempo la asignación de direcciones IPv4 en pequeños bloques para los nuevos entrantes, que le van a permitir también tener esa configuración de sus redes, de sus servicios, con ambas tecnologías, IPv4 e IPv6. Entonces, corregido esto, desde mi punto de vista, esas direcciones no son exactamente necesarias, pero sí es cierto que si alguien tiene esas direcciones y las hace disponibles en el mercado, otros las van a querer, ¿no? Y por lo tanto hay que facilitar reglas para que esas transferencias puedan ser hechas, y eso es en lo que se está trabajando en todas las regiones. En algunas regiones ya existen esas reglas, en otras se están discutiendo, porque también es muy importante para la comunidad de Internet en general tener datos precisos sobre las asignaciones, mantener la fidelidad de la información que tenemos sobre los registros de las direcciones IP que han sido asignadas, y por eso es importante adaptarse a esta nueva situación. Pero repito la conclusión, creo que eso no es exactamente necesario, sino que lo necesario es adaptarse a esa situación, y hay que tener cuidado también en pensar que si nos focalizamos en la importancia de este mercado de direcciones IPv4, podemos estar enlenteciendo el deployment de IPv6, que es realmente donde tenemos que tener el foco y toda nuestra energía. Gracias.
Thank you, Raul. I'm going to take a comment from Jeff, and then I'm going to go to the gentleman on the floor over here. So, Jeff, just for you first, and then you wanted to comment, yeah?
I wanted to very quickly respond to your why should we care? What's in it for the consumer?
Yes.
It's going to cost you. In the short term, it's going to cost you. Typically right now, an ISP in the US makes $400 a year from a customer. They make profit from that, from their annual returns, around $140 per year per customer. Whichever way you look at carrier grade NATs, V6, even buying addresses on the market, the cost when you amortise all of the costs and siphon it back down is around $40 per year per customer. So in other words, what you would see immediately is around a 10% price rise. But the longer term is more dismal. Because in the last 20 years, what's happened is you've actually seen an open system at work. There can be good ideas in a dorm that creates $1 billion industry next week. The Facebooks of this world are because the network is open. As soon as you put carrier-grade NATs and other forms of middleware right inside the network, what you're going to lose the next second is openness. The current incumbents can buy a place at the table. So if you're Google or Apple, this is great. But the barriers to entry are then supreme. Nothing gets innovated. Nothing happens. If you thought that the telephone world of the 1980s was dismal, if you thought that Microsoft represented a huge regulatory problem over monopolies, if that was your outlook, you haven't seen anything. Because if you manage to monopolize the current environment, where the world of telecommunications and information is now incredibly rich, and place it in the hands of a very, very small number of providers simply by virtue of being inside a network that can no longer innovate, life is over. That's the long-term risk that you as a consumer face.
So in simple terms, if I invent something that needs a large number of IP addresses, I can be held to ransom because those IP addresses are privately held and I have to buy them. Is that effectively what you mean?
Where do you put your servers?
Yes.
Because you can't put them out there on the open net because all of a sudden the carrier-grade NATs aren't working very well. The limited ports are actually set to let the Googles of this world through. Once you get scarcity becomes something that is exploited.
Got it. Gentleman at the microphone. And then anyone else on the panel who wants to say something. You don't have to be an IPv6 or 4 expert in order to speak. Honestly. Sir.
Yes. Martin Levy from Hurricane Electric, and I've probably spent 10 years focusing on IPv6. It's 2012. I want to correct just something that was said earlier and go with a different vector than Jeff has gone. The reality is that it is 2012, and most of the time through classic standard technology refresh within inside the telecom world, within inside the hosting world, less so within inside the consumer world, we've actually now got equipment that's capable of talking V6. There is still an effort to convince people to actually type the commands to enable V6, but the graphs are at least up and to the right and show that there is more V6 being built into the core of the network. There's more V6 being built into some of the major sources of information, sources of websites, such as the players that supported World V6 Day, World V6 launch, the major content players. So I just want to push a little bit of a positive message towards V6 and say, sure, there is a classic, you could be the last mover and say everything is fine, but in reality, the water's already warm today. Come on in. There are a lot of people that put a lot of effort into it. My argument would not have gone anywhere 4 or 5 years ago, because 4 or 5 years ago I would have had technology against me in reality. But it's 2012, and I do think, solidly think, I have technology in my favor at the moment. And last thing is, last panel today, WS99 V6. Come on in and join in.
Advertise your panels here. I started it, it's my fault. Dmitry?
Thank you. Dmitry Burkov, RapidC Executive Board. I want to comment this idea to interpret IPv4 as a huge market. For me, it's like to compare with, yes, there are 4 billion addresses formally, but it's like to compare that we have 4 billion Coca-Cola bottles. And imagine a market with 4 billion Coca-Cola bottles. It's one side. From another side, we simply ignore, and some people who propose and push it, that technically, in predictable future, we can use only no more than 16 million prefixes. IPv4 is scarce, and we can use it for future. Thank you.
Thank you, Dmitry. Henriette.
Chris, I have a question, and I have very limited understanding of the implications. But what we have heard quite often in working with people in the internet who are supporting secure online communications for human rights defenders or for activists and journalists in countries where there's quite a high degree of unprocedural surveillance and interception of online communications, that IPv6 comes with a danger that it could be easier for repressive regimes to trace and track how users are using the internet, what content they're accessing. Does this imply that we need to also invest in public policy with stronger protections for rights of privacy and anonymity on the internet?
Well,
once IPv6 has been deployed?
Well, let's deal with the technical question first, because you don't need to invest in all of that stuff if the technical assumption is incorrect. So I'm going to go to Jeff, but if anybody else from the RIs wants to comment, please do. Jeff?
Nothing would be further from the truth. If you're behind a carrier-grade NAT, that carrier-grade NAT knows everything you do, every website, everything, every ad, every email, every site you went to at any point in time is logged at that carrier-grade NAT. That carrier-grade NAT is not your NAT. It's owned by your operator. So if you're worried at all about somebody else having the knowledge of what you're doing, then maybe sitting behind a carrier-grade NAT is a cause for some concern on your part, and perhaps it should be. Behind IPv6, obviously deep packet inspection is always an option, but when you've got an end-to-end protocol and you're desperately concerned about someone looking inside, then you encrypt. That's what folk do. As long as you've got an end-to-end protocol, you can encrypt. If you haven't got an end-to-end protocol, encryption won't work. So nothing could be further from the truth that V6 is the problem. I think you will find that V6 is perhaps the only thing you could deploy at that point, and the solutions we have in v4 for this, things like onion routing and so on, are relatively gross hacks on a theme that rely on the kindness of strangers to function, which in terms of privacy is not a good place to be.
Thank you, Jeff. I'm going to take Milton very briefly and then the gentleman at the microphone, and then we're going to wrap this up, and Pedro, we're going to wrap this up and head into the next section. So, Milton, first for you.
Yeah, I just want to emphasize that I agree with what Jeff said about carrier-grade nets and the industrial implications of the growth of this kind of kludges on the Internet. And that was why I was somewhat surprised to hear him say that we didn't need the v4 market, we could just deploy carrier-grade nets. I think the first best option is to make a totally efficient use of the existing v4 space, and the next is to migrate to v6 so that you maintain the end-to-end system. And the question we really need to be thinking about, the question I want to put in everybody's mind here is, what is the date that you can turn off v4? Think about when that date occurs. Is it? I cannot come with too many reasonable scenarios under which it is less than 10 years from now. Some people say 25, and of course some people suggest never. But we're talking about 10 to 25 years at least of a transition period.
Thank you. Pedro, briefly. And you want to take the gentleman first? Okay, sir.
Hi, my name is Peter Timish. I've got a little bad case of laryngitis. I come from Adrex, which is the largest marketplace in the world. We currently have seen a metric that should matter. We really only represent network operators, network service providers, which is the core of our business. We have expressions of interest from a little more than 650 companies around the world in the last 12 months. And we have seen a remarkable uptick in the European region. So it is possible that there is a market blowing up quickly, and regardless of what goes in this room, the questions we get are dramatic, and the concerns they have are remarkable. So to Jeff's point, many of them are using address sharing tools, but the immense number are looking for direct access to large number of blocks. Thanks.
Thank you, sir. Pedro, you have the final
Thank
word.
You, Chris. As a gentleman in the audience mentioned, we are in 2012. I remember that when the IPv6 or the IPv4 crisis started, one deadline was 1998, if I remember well. Everybody said, and we have to solve the problem until 1998. But we done a lot of re-engineering in the network, in protocols for dynamic allocation of addresses, and we have been watching the years moving, and it seems like doing a race, and the finish line is moving forward. And this is a bit difficult. For example, I have been contacting politicians stating that government should put in place policies for the public administration to be a promoter of IPv6, but when I approach politicians, from time to time they change. But our deadline is also changing, and this is a problem. But for example, after the IPv6 launch that occurred this year, we saw a big increase in IPv6 traffic. We ran a domain interchange point in Portugal. Now from the academic network, more or less 10% of the traffic is IPv6, so it has been growing very rapidly, but there is not a killer application, and that is a problem.
Thank you. We are going to take one more comment just because it's you, Paul.
Oh, thank you, Chris. Look, I've just got a few short points to make. Can you hear me? We know a couple of things about IPv6. One of those that we've always known is that the transition to IPv6 is going to work best if everyone moves at once. We've also learned more recently that no one really cares about IPv6 until they run out of IPv4. The benefit of the transfer system, of an active transfer market in IPv4, is actually more about spreading the motivation for IPv6 towards a successful transition, rather than it is about providing access to IPv4 for the sake of IPv4. So hopefully that will be a relatively short-term situation. As for the price of IPv4 addresses,
there's supposedly a market price around at the moment of $11 per address, and that sounds very cheap by some measures, but it quickly escalates to tens or even hundreds of millions of dollars for large blocks, and we are not seeing those sorts of transfers happening. So I guess what we've got going on now is a sort of a Dutch auction where the price is going to come down until we really see some transfers happening, and we can look forward to that day because ISPs who don't have access to V4 and who need it are going to benefit by that. I think the idea of the IPv4 transfer market moving to the sort of craziness that we see in the domain name world is also really unrealistic. What we have is two options. We have the option of buying IPv4, we have the option of transitioning to IPv6, and to imagine that IPv4 is going to escalate in an unlimited way is like putting a price on horses the day that the Model T started rolling off the production line. It's just not going to happen. There is a cost to transitioning to IPv6, and if the IPv4 address space is too expensive, then IPv6 becomes the obvious solution, which is a good thing. And so I think the beauty of that is actually that it sort of rationalises the choice for IPv6 amongst ISPs who are trying to make a choice at the moment between sort of options that are a little bit hard to cost. And as for the transition to the length of the transition to IPv6, maybe there'll be a long tail, as Milton said, but you might think about it like the ISPs who used to provide modem access, dial-up modem access to their infrastructure. I don't think anyone does that anymore. They actually make an active decision to turn it off once they get down below a small handful of users who are using it, and they actually benefit by doing that because they don't have to maintain the two protocols anymore. So I think that's a fairly easy answer as well. It's more that we forget about and don't care about IPv4 anymore than that we have to worry about how long it's going to last in the internet. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Okay. Thanks very much, everybody. I'm going to pass you back to Bill, who's going to move on to the next topic.
Thank you, Chris. And I must say I really took heart from one thing I heard in that session, which is that there's such a thing as a last mover advantage. As a perpetual last mover myself, I feel very comforted. Speaking of questions of adaptation, we're going to now turn to a very uncontroversial topic, which is the International Telecommunications Regulations and the forthcoming World Conference on International Telecommunication to be held in Dubai in December under the auspices of the International Telecommunication Union. And there has been a great deal of talk about this topic, obviously, in the global sphere, both in the political environment, including at the national level, various governments debating these issues, in the blogosphere, in the mass media, et cetera, and of course within the International Telecommunication Union itself, where governments have been engaged in a extended process of debating the revision of the ITRs, which were last updated in 1988, and since I believe 1999, there has been a series of expert groups and council working groups and so on that have been looking at the question of whether or not the International Telecommunication Regulations, which are, after all, a binding international treaty, should be adapted updated and adapted to the current environment. And this has led to, as I say, a great deal of discussion and debate among many parties. We had a very lively workshop on this yesterday, and we thought that it would be good to raise some of those questions here with the panel as well. Given the lapse, the way time is going here, I think we will squeeze the last of our four topics, enhanced cooperation, at the back end, and I think that's probably fine. We did enhanced cooperation last year in this CIR main session for some time, so I think we can be fairly brief on that one. This one I think will probably engender a little bit more discussion. So let's start with a basic question. Can somebody give me just in the event that there's anybody in the room who has not been following this, perhaps David Gross, would you feel you could give just a couple of minutes of brief overview of where we are, what this process is about, the timelines, et cetera, et cetera? That'd be helpful to make sure everybody here is on the same page.
Yes, this is actually a topic I feel more competent to address. Thank you very much. Let me first disclose that because I am a member of the U.S. delegation, the views that I express either are or should be interpreted as being completely consistent with the U.S. views on the subject. So take that as you will. And Fiona, being on the panel, who's also a member of the U.S. delegation, can correct anything I might misstate by pure accident. In terms of background, the ITRs were established, the most recent version was established in 1988, about 24 years ago. They are an extraordinarily short treaty document. They have often been viewed as having the flexibility that has allowed for the extraordinary changes in the telephony industry in the almost quarter century since they were established in Melbourne, Australia in 1988. There has been over many years an increasing call for the world community and particularly the governments involved, the 193 governments involved at the ITU, to relook at whether or not there should be changes made to those ITRs in order to bring them up to date. As a result of decisions made by the ITU at the Plenipotentiary and elsewhere, the decision was made to have a WICIT, a World Conference on International Telecommunications, that will begin in Dubai in early December, going from December 3rd to December 14th. As you can tell from those dates, it is an extraordinarily brief treaty writing conference. It is only 2 weeks long, and in fact, for those of you who are familiar with the ITU would quickly recognize that because of the need to do translations into all of the UN languages and the need to have legal reviews by all governments prior to signing of those agreements, that in fact we only will have about 8 days for governments to negotiate those agreements. Because it is the ITU, it will be a government-only negotiation, although I understand that a certain number of governments, like the U.S. government, will have private sector members on those delegations. But ultimately, it will be an intergovernmental negotiation. There have been proposals made for now the better part of a year or longer by a large number of interested parties. The process was opened up to allow for submissions to be made by basically any interested party, governments and non-governmental groups alike. However, it's important to recognize that the document that will be the source of the actual negotiations in Dubai will reflect proposals made by member states. That is, proposals made by non-governmental organizations are for the purposes of informing the dialogue and discussions and could be adopted by member states, but there is no requirement that they be a part of the actual negotiations. So we will be going to Dubai in just a couple of weeks for what will be an extraordinarily important, as illustrated by so many of the discussions here at the IGF, and we will have a decision on what, if any, changes should be made to the ITRs by the middle of December.
Thank you, David. That was very helpful. I guess since you made a disclosure, I will add a small addendum. Some governments also have civil society and the technical community in their delegations, and as a member of the U.S. delegation, I will say that nothing I'm saying here has any opinion behind it whatsoever. So, therefore, I think I'm covered. Okay, so let's talk a bit about, well, first of all, a topic that was raised at some length yesterday in the workshop that we had. Why are we talking about this at all at the IGF? What is the concern with regard to the internet and internet governance that arises with regard to the proposals that have been put forward? Some folks have argued that there is no connection, that internet governance is just names and numbers managed by ICANN and the RIRs and so on. So therefore, there's not a question of Internet governance implied here. Others have said, no, there's a broad definition on Internet governance that was agreed in the Tunis Agenda for the Information Society, and that if you have treaty provisions that directly impact the regulation at the global level of the Internet, that this constitutes Internet governance. So let's talk about some of those proposals, the issues that are around them. And let's start, for example, with the question of definitions. There have been a number of suggestions in both during the preparatory process in the Council Working Group and now in some of the national proposals that have come out to adapt the definition of telecommunications that's long been in the international instruments to include such things as and processing, which implies information processing and ergo the Internet, and or to expand the definition to say telecommunications / ICTs. So I wonder how might if that kind of language is included in this treaty, how might that interpret how one reads all the treaty provisions and their implications? Who would like to address the definitional question? Well, David, we can come back to you, and then let's see if we get some others. Yes.
Well, thank you very much. And let me just begin by saying you're certainly correct. The definitions will be an important part of the negotiations at WCIT. I think there are at least two important aspects in terms of the definition of telecommunications that you were referring to. One is, I think it's always important to recognize that the term telecommunications is defined in the Convention and in the Constitution, and I believe it's now well recognized that there is no opportunity to revise that definition in the ITRs as an effective matter, because it is already otherwise defined or defined in the primary document for the ITU. Having said that, there seems to be at least two methods that people are using to try to expand the jurisdiction, or at least arguably expand the jurisdiction of the ITU in this area. One is that some are trying to suggest that the term telecommunications already includes ICTs, information communications technologies. And I would refer, for example, to the recently submitted proposal by the Arab state administrations for the common proposals for the work of the conference, in which I would read that they say that although the term telecommunications and its definition in both the ITRs and the Convention and the Constitution already cover ICTs, it is quite useful to clearly reflect this by having another definition for something called telecommunications / ICTs. So in essence, very explicitly in black and white, the Arab states, a very significant and a very important part of the ITU community, of course, takes the positions that the term that was been long defined by the ITU, well even before Internet, I would submit, already includes this. So if that is true, that means the ITU has some extraordinary jurisdiction, at least argument in favor of them already having some extraordinary jurisdiction over these issues and the Internet issues. And then similarly, as you pointed out, there are a number of proposals to expand, to create a new definition for something called telecommunications / ICT that looks very much like the definition, the established definition of telecommunications, but includes the word processing, which for, I think, most observers would include Internet-related issues as well. And there are many others as well, but just on the definitions, those are two.
Right. So actually, in a way, you could say there's three possible intersections. One is if you could adapt the definition to explicitly cover Internet, then of course the entire instrument applies. Secondly, if you are a government that is of the view that the term telecommunication already entails the Internet, then of course from your standpoint in implementing the agreements, you could say that we're going to regard this as applicable to the Internet. And then thirdly, you also have some specific proposals that a number of governments have made that are directly related to the Internet and cannot be understood in any other way, such as defining terms like spam, IP interconnection, and so on, and putting them into the international telecommunication regulations. All of which raises some interesting questions, I think. Let's take one example, routing. Now, there are governments that have said, we have problems with identifying where the traffic is coming in from. And in the telephone environment, this can include concerns such as, people who get these telephone calls from an unidentified number, and it turns out they get a big telephone bill at the end of the month because it's come from some shady operation in a foreign country, and they've been billed very high, and then they go and they complain to their government. So the carriers would like to be able to know where the call's coming in from. There's also the revenue aspect. The carriers that used to get a lot of money from settlements are concerned that now it's harder to see where the traffic is coming in from. So in the telephone environment, there's one set of concerns. But if you start to expand this to the Internet, then you have a question of identifying where the bits are coming from. And some of the proposals that have been made by national governments suggest that carriers should be able to do this. So I see Jeff smiling. So I wonder if Jeff has a view on the feasibility and practicality of that kind of an approach.
So in many parts of the world, folk, to bring down the costs of international traffic, use web proxies. It's a very well-known technology. You intercept the outgoing HTTP request, have a look inside your local cache, and deliver the content directly. The packet never heads over to its intended destination. The content comes from a local web cache. The customer is happy. The customer enjoys a cheaper service. The packet didn't go to its intended destination. Obviously, if the regulation said all packets must be delivered to where they're intended, this widespread industry use of proxies is, of course, contrary to this proposed regulatory measure. This is rather weird, insane. We also talked a few seconds ago about the use of carrier-grade NATs, the use of a technology that deliberately alters the addresses in a packet, deliberately sends different information than was at the source. So under the regulations that insist that nothing is changed in the packet, we couldn't do this? This is this kind of exercise of regulatory insanity, where the folk who actually understand the technology and the folk who are working at the regulations come from not just entirely different departments, but from entirely different backgrounds and entirely different understanding. And that what we actually do inside the network to make it work sometimes seems to be entirely contrary to some of these regulatory proposals, which, for perhaps the best of motives, espouse answers with quite profound technical implications that quite frankly cut across most of the current security and operating practices that we use in the internet today. And that just seems to be the height of building a regulatory framework with absolutely no idea of the foundation on which it's meant to be constructed.
Okay. Well, there's no doubt that part of the dialogue that's happened internationally around these issues is that some people have raised questions about whether or not the revision of the ITRs in accordance with some of the proposals that have been made might somehow impact internet freedoms. And I think this routing question is an interesting one in this context. Those who have raised concerns about human rights, freedom of speech, things like that, see the possibility that all communications routings would be identifiable as potentially problematic. I wonder, Henriette, if you had any thoughts on that particular issue from a civil society standpoint.
Thank you, Bill. Yes, I agree, and I think Jeff has put it very well. So there is a certain lack of feasibility of this process, but also just even the attempt to do that type of tracking and tracing in an internet environment has very different implications from just doing that in a traditional telephony environment. So I do think it is of great concern to those of us who believe the internet is an incredibly important platform for freedom of communication. And one of the rights that's very important is the right to privacy and then also the right to anonymity. But I think there are broader concerns in the ITR revision, and I think it relates to the definitional issue. It also relates to the introduction of issues such as cybersecurity in the ITRs. These are issues that go beyond basic telecommunications, and that can have profound impacts on how people use the internet and what they do on the internet. And I don't think the ITU is the appropriate body to deal with those types of or to make regulations about those types of public policy issues. I do think the ITU, like so many other agencies, there is convergence. It's a reality. The universe of telecommunications and the universe of internet protocol don't operate in separate dimensions. But I think there's a very big difference between the ITU being involved in a process that discusses an issue such as cybersecurity, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, trying to build that into the regulatory framework. And I think just perhaps another point that this has brought up for civil society, the wicked process, is multi-stakeholder participation. I think the ITU was the institution that created the precedent for multi-stakeholder participation in international decision-making around ICTs with the WSIS. But this process has demonstrated that there isn't sufficient capacity for non-governmental voices to be part of a process that is very important. And I think maybe that's going to be one of the lasting positive outcomes of this wicked process, that it's hopefully making member states, as well as the ITU itself as an institution, rethink how it facilitates effective multi-stakeholder participation.
Thank you. Well, the routing question also relates to a broader kind of issue, and certainly it's been one of the overarching meta or driving aspects of this whole process, which is the financial aspects and the funding of international communications, and where is the money going to come from, and so on. And you see that some parties have been concerned about the changes in the global environment and how they've impacted carrier revenues, etc., and have tried to think about what kind of business model and what kind of regulatory structure would be needed to try to preserve the financial position of the telecommunications industry in this rapidly changing environment. And I know we have here on the panel with us, and he's not had a chance to speak yet, Luigi Gambardella, who is the chairman of the European Telecommunications Network Organization, ETNO. ETNO made a proposal for the consideration of the governments, which has drawn quite a lot of attention to try to think about how new business models might be developed. Perhaps, Luigi, you'd like to explain a bit what your thinking has been and what the status of your proposal is.
Bill, thanks a lot. First, I would like to thank for the invitation. I am particularly glad to be here and to be here in Baku and to attend this panel. Even if we are here at the IGF more to listen, mainly to listen rather than to speak, because sometimes it's more interesting to listen the other rather than to speak. But if I may say a few words before to answer your question. Following these days, very interesting days in IGF, I think that one of the main messages that is coming from this meeting is that we need to work all together. And really I think that all of us have the same goal: preserve the internet of today and work for a better internet. I was reading right now what Obama, which has been re-elected, has said, and I think this should be true also for the internet. The best is yet to come, and but things need to change. And internet is global. and require global solutions. Now, and I think we believe that Wicked Dubai Conference should be a success. Wicked Dubai Conference has to be a success. And we are confident that Wicked Dubai Conference will be a success. I see that he's in the room in the first row. Mohamed Al-Ghanim is the Director General of TRA of UAE, and he's the Chairman of Wicked, and we are sure that under his leadership this will happen, and the Dubai conference will be remembered as a big success. But we should work in order to have a win-win result for all the stakeholders. It's not only about one part, Bill, who has to gain and another should lose. We should, all of us, try to win. That's the issue. And I liked what Fedi, the new chairman, the new CEO and chairman of ICANN, said, which I believe is very important, because we have to change, if I may say, also the tone of our conversation, not only the substance. And the tone is important as the substance. When he said a new season of cooperation and engagement is needed, we believe that this is true, and we will work in order to have such kind of new season of cooperation and engagement. But let me spend some words first to clarify from our point of view what is our proposal, and then where we are and what we expect from, in a few minutes, the result of the Wicked. As has been recognized, and I think on this everybody agree, the telecommunication market and the telecom industry as a whole is undergoing a fundamental shift, catalyzed by the availability of a higher bandwidth connectivity. New applications and services are being enabled that go far beyond the traditional services of voice calling. In both the consumer and enterprise segment, services such as voice over IP, social networking, instant messaging, and the rise of the application have changed the way customers use their mobile and fixed connections. And this development is significant, and telecom operators need to adapt and rebalance their tariff structure between voice and data services. The aim of the Etono proposal is to, and has been to contribute to the achievement of what we are called, and I'm happy to listening the speech of Larry Strickling yesterday. He has even recognized the important to us, and such important aspect as a more sustainable model for the internet. Let me very clear on one point which has been misinterpreted, communicated in the wrong way. Etono is not asking, has never asked for increased regulatory intervention, but the aim of our proposal is to establish a clear reference for commercial negotiations. The current interconnection model has some shortcomings that need to be addressed. Today, there is a huge disproportion amongst revenues and a clear shift of value towards players who are not contributing to network investment. Traffic and revenue flows need to be realigned in order to assure the economic viability of infrastructure investment and the sustainability of the whole ecosystem. We believe, Etono believe, that the revised ITR should acknowledge these challenges, and the principle that fair compensation is received for carrier traffic and operator revenue should not be disconnected from the investment needs caused by rapid internet traffic growth. I was saying, participating from the floor to the workshop of yesterday, just to give you a figure, that only the European telecom operators have invested in 1 year about 44 billion euro in the infrastructure. Now, the ITRs, we believe they should be flexible enough so as to further encourage future growth and the sustainable development of telecom markets, while respecting the guiding principle that led to the successful development of the internet, private sector leadership, independent multi-stakeholder government, and commercial agreements. And we are, as I said, certainly not asking for any change to the current internet governance model, which is based on private sector leadership and multi-stakeholder dialogue. Just to come back 1 second to what you were saying at the beginning on definitions. For example, you know that in Europe, according to the EU framework, IP interconnection is a telecom service and is not an internet service. Just to let you know what kind of problems we have in front of us and why we are having such difficult and complex discussion. So, as I said, and the paradox of this discussion is that we, as telecom operators, European telecom operators, we want to avoid the decision that would prevent new business model from emerging and would hamper differentiated offers and limiting consumer choice. And there is a risk of undesirable economic and technical regulation of operator rights, terms and conditions will be much higher if the development of the internet continue to be jeopardized by the lack of sustainability and or by the lack of end consumer satisfaction. And we, just to be clear also this point, in particular here in this place is important to reaffirm, we have reiterated on many occasions our commitment to an open internet and to continue enabling consumers to access services and applications of their choice,
Luigi,
as well as being
if I could ask you to just describe the main points of your proposal as time is going short.
Yes, I was already there, and just, I'm sorry for that, but just to a few minutes, I think was important from our point of view to use this occasion to clarify some aspect of our proposal. Our proposal called for a new IP internet interconnection ecosystem that provide end-to-end quality of service delivery in addition to best effort delivery, enabling the provision of value-added network services to both end consumers and OTT player and content providers. So in one word, the operators, we believe the operators should be able to negotiate commercial agreements to achieve a sustainable compensation for telecom service. And by that proposal is not asking to impose any premium service obligation on network operators, because the quality of service delivery will be based only on commercial agreement.
Okay, so we
yes. Now, and if I may, just a few words on how we see the situation now. As has been said correctly by David Gross, who has a big experience on this. We are not a member we are not state member, not yet. We are observer. So we made our proposal. We welcome the fact that several member states, not only Europe but also outside Europe, have agreed with the issue that we have raised, and not only on the relevance but on the fact that this issue is relevant, is very relevant for the future of the sector and has to be addressed, within the ITU and or in other some fora. Now, will be up to the member states to decide whether such kind of proposal should be addressed also within the ITR. And this we will leave to the member states and to the discussion that they will have in Dubai. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Luigi. So the core kind of concepts that have attracted a lot of attention, the notion that the regulations would include provisions that explicitly mention a sender pays sort of principle as a possibility in the negotiation of what you call fair and sustainable compensation, and a recognition of quality of service as a key concern as well. And some of these ideas have come up in, for example, proposals from some countries in Africa and elsewhere that have picked up on some of these points. Although not the sender pays part, but the other bits. I wonder if I could, yes, just briefly, and then I.
Yes, but just one small comment is this. We also, just to be clear on this point, we see the ITR has high-level principles. Mm-hmm. Right, and we saw as let me say a constitution, right? So in the Constitution, you can put some rights. Some rights. For example, in the Italian Constitution is written that all the Italian citizens have the right to work. Even if does not mean that all the Italians have a job. But it's important for us to underline the fact we believe, and that was the reason why we made such proposal, that we believe that it's important to reaffirm that the operators have the right to negotiate commercial agreement without limitation. And we don't support further regulation. Just to be clear on this point. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I'm wondering, from a developing country standpoint, how would this notion of having a sender pays type of approach officially recognized as an option that should, in the international regulations, would that help to promote, in the views of the panel, access to and use of information resources in the developing world? I wonder if the ambassador has a view on this, and also Milton and Henriette.
Thank you. Well, in regard to the, can you hear me? The Dubai conference, our position is still being finalized. However, there are some parameters that will guide our participation in the conference. Well, first of all, we are, besides having a multi-stakeholder process of preparation led by the Brazilian regulating agency, but in full consultation with stakeholders, we are also discussing and with international partners from the various groupings and regions in order to best refine our positions. Some of the basic parameters is that we would, as I have said before, take a rather, let's say, conservative approach, in the sense that we agree that the ITU constitution, the basic elements that are there should be retained, that the ITR should be aligned to the existing constitution and rules. So we are not aiming at, as an outcome of Dubai, to enlarge the competence of ITU. We think the competence, the areas to be dealt with by the ITR should be restricted to those technical aspects that have been dealt by ITU. Do not seek an expansion in that regard. We have a particular concern about costs, the roaming costs. We are putting forward a proposal on that. We'd like to discuss the issue that is of concern to, we understand, not only Brazil, but to the developing world in general. So this is one of the specific items we'd like to discuss, but in the, as I have said, the overall framework of, let's say, a conservative approach in regard to the mandates and to the areas in which ITU should play a role in this. Thank you.
Thank you. Milton, do you have a thought on the possibility of the sender pays, sort of a model in which, inter alia, the so-called, I love this new term, over-the-top players would also play a role in helping with the financing of the build-out of the environment? What are your thoughts on this?
Okay, so literally speaking, I mean, if somebody is really pushing for a sender pays principle on internet-based packet communications, it's simply not viable. It's a non-starter. It's not going to happen, and I'm actually confident that Telecom Italia and other supporters of the Etno proposal will back off of that thing very quickly and realize that it was a mistake to even put that phrase in the proposal. When it comes to quality of service, my question for Etno and for the supporters of that is, and for the opponents, is sort of, what's all the fuss about? Can't they do that already? In other words, if they have a service to sell to a over-the-top player who can come to them and say, I can guarantee or prioritize your service, and those over-the-top players want to utilize that service, what exactly is stopping them? There's nothing in the ITRs, there's nothing in Article 9 that stops them from negotiating that. Now, in certain governments, there might be national laws of the net neutrality sort that might stop them from prioritizing in a discriminatory manner. So it seems to me that what Edna was asking for is some kind of a recognition of this principle, and that we can have a fruitful debate about that, but it's not, as long as sender pays is out of the picture, this is not the end of the world. Like so much about Wicket, the whole thing has kind of been blown out of proportion.
I see. Okay. Henriette, you would like to reply?
Thank you, Bill. I think 3-hour panels should give the panelists coffee in the middle. I think I agree with the Brazilian approach. I think general principles. I think that roaming, however, is an important issue. I would be delighted if regulators can compel European operators to reduce their roaming charges. But to come to sender pays from a developing country perspective, I think the implications are dire. And I think on top of a growing broadband divide, I was in a workshop yesterday where we discussed a recent OECD report that looked at the growing broadband divide between developed and developing countries. I think implications for access to information and knowledge are really serious. But I want to ask the moderator to give the floor to a colleague of mine who's in the audience from a policy think tank in Asia, Rohan Samarajiva, who wrote a very comprehensive and well-argued paper recently that describes very clearly why sender pays is going to be very bad for developing countries. So if you don't mind, just give him a moment to explain.
I'm perfectly happy to do that. Rohan, would you like to make a comment, please? Rohan's a former regulator from Sri Lanka and wrote an interesting paper detailing some of the potential implications. Unfortunately, we have a tradition here in this session of the non-functioning microphone. There we go.
Thank you. The basic issue is that everybody is concerned about investment. I appreciate Mr. Gambadella's concern about the need to invest in the infrastructure that will connect the poor of the world, the people that I work with, the people in my region, to the internet. What will yield investment are good business models. What will support good business models is demand. What will yield demand, as we have seen from the research that we are conducting in places like Indonesia, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, is attractive content. So today what we have is a situation where, just to illustrate using a case, a young person in Indonesia will be requesting a video. The video would most probably have been made in Indonesia, but it is sitting on a server in another country on YouTube. When this information is being requested, what the sending party network pays principle says is that that network has to pay the network in Indonesia. Does this make any sense? Information is requested by a customer of the Indonesian company, and payment is to be made by somebody else. In addition, what this will do is that the transaction costs, I know that both the Arab states and Mr. Gambadella's organization are talking about commercial agreements. But how many commercial agreements would have to be entered into? Today we know that the peering agreements that are entered into are not based on written text. They are handshake agreements. Now we are talking about thousands upon thousands of agreements that will have to be entered into by companies. And I have been in the middle as a former regulator of trying to mediate some of these issues with regard to voice telecommunications. And I know how complicated those agreements were. Now we are going to have another layer of complicated agreements at some point, particularly for the poor countries, particularly for areas that are not seen as having high advertising potential. There will come a time when networks and over-the-top providers will say, we can't do this anymore, transaction costs are too high, the government regulated. The Arab states propose that its government must consider appropriate the access charges. The government regulated charges are too high. We will no longer provide our services to these areas. What you're going to get is a balkanized internet. With a balkanized internet, we will lose the driver that is bringing our people into the internet through innovative business models. What I would say is if your current business models are not yielding investment, you might want to rethink them. Thank you.
Thank you, Rohan. I think we should focus on the principles and not any particular organizations in this context, but nevertheless, the point remains. Balkanization of the internet is a possible result of changes in the charging arrangements. And by the way, this also ties into the question of how we define who is subject to the agreement and whether or not it's just going to continue to be administrations and recognized operating agencies as before, or operating agencies more generally, in which case all these things become rather different. I see Fiona waving at me. Perhaps you'd like to add something.
Sure, I think that's exactly where I was going. There's two foundational issues for the discussion in Dubai. One is the definitions, and the second is scope, and that's who these obligations would actually apply to, recognized operating agencies or operating agencies. And both of these issues are foundational to the U.S. position, which is, I'm sure, was articulated quite well yesterday in the session, and is fairly well known in terms of what our position is. With respect to the ETNO proposal, the United States has said repeatedly it would not support this kind of proposal for the ITU and for the ITRs. I appreciate Luigi suggesting we have a shared objective of preserving the internet of today. Putting a toll booth on the internet, which is exactly kind of what his proposal would do, doesn't do that. And as very eloquently articulated by the gentleman in the audience, it doesn't help development. Now, we all agree we have to discuss sustainability of the internet and sustainability of broadband, but doing it in a treaty document amongst member states is not the right place nor the right venue. And doing it in a place where 95% of the people in this room could not speak doesn't really seem the best way to solve a problem on internet policy. And that's one of the reasons why we won't support this proposal at this conference.
Thank you. You've raised another important aspect of this is there may be legitimate concerns behind some of the proposals that have been controversial and debated, particularly with regard to financial aspects for developing countries. The question becomes, is this particular instrument the appropriate place to try to address them, or may there be better ways to approach some of these questions? I just put that on the table. Alice, I'd like to go to the audience pretty soon, because we're actually, believe it or not, moving towards the end of this session, but we do want to have time for the discussion with the audience, and we've got the chairman of the conference here as well. But I just wondered, I know I've talked with you about some of the discussions in Africa about the ITRs and the concerns that have been expressed by some of the ministries and administrations there about the changing telecom environment. Given the kind of a response that we've had here, how can we go about then trying to accelerate development, and what role do the ITRs perhaps play in helping development from the standpoint of the governments you've been talking to?
Thank you, Bill. First, a disclaimer to say that I cannot really speak on behalf of the Africa region, neither can I speak on behalf of Kenya, because Kenya hasn't actually developed a position, and we are still planning on having multi-stakeholder consultations that are going to be led by the Communications Commission of Kenya, which would mean then, currently we are supporting the Africa Common Position. But that is going to change depending on what proposals are presented by the various stakeholders at the national level. So I think we are in the same position similar to Brazil. And I think that's what's important in terms of ensuring that quite a number of the stakeholders are able to contribute to some of these discussions and the development of national positions, which then obviously automatically would link to the view or the vision we have for ICTs and the internet for development. And taking into consideration, especially for African countries, to remember that communication networks, deliver all types of services, and so most of these issues are actually quite important for a lot of the African countries. But I am very sure, I think quite positive that none of the African governments, especially at least the Kenyan government, is going to come up or support any proposals that are likely to have an outcome that curtails development, especially looking at how far we've come at the national level in terms of the various innovative and creative ways we've used the internet. And just to mention some of them is a mobile money and mobile applications for development. And so there's I know for sure that the government and various stakeholders at the national level will be very keen to ensure that the proposals they support, or at least we support development generally. Yeah.
Oh, no. I mean, Kenya's been very progressive on these issues. I was not asking you about your national position, just to reflect some of the sentiment that I've heard in the region. But, okay, I do want to go to the floor, but I think Luigi has had several people direct comments to him, and I should give him a quick minute to respond, and then I'll take a couple of quick points from others, and then we'll go to the floor. Luigi.
First of all, I would like to say a few things regarding the African position and of several countries. We have a lot of respect for them and for everybody, because I think it's not up to us to judge what is better for them. I think it's up to them to decide what they believe is better for them. And we are sure that they have all the instrument, all the knowledge to understand what is better for them. So this will be discussed, judged by them. Obviously, what are the concerns in general also outside Europe? The concerns are, and the question is, what is happening, has happened in Europe, will happen also in our region? Will happen also in our country? The telecom operator will start to fail, will start to reduce revenue. Who will invest in local infrastructures? There will continue to be the same level of local investment. So this is the question that they are raising, and there are some concern regarding this. Then, what is the right way to solve the problem? It's up to them and up to the member states to decide. Another thing is this, and when we speak about sending party network pay, we have to clarify also this point. We never asked to regulate sending party pay network pay, but always we said on commercial basis, with commercial agreement. As far as I know, in the US, already operators are using this model. So this is already happening. Thank you.
Right. Well, I think we can all agree that the telecom industry certainly does need to find new sources of revenue, and this is certainly well, okay, Jeff doesn't think they need new sources of revenue. They should just probably retire, I suppose, right?
No, the telecom industry used to be a vertically integrated industry that had services as well as transmission. It was a complete one-stop shop. But on the other hand, my water company simply delivers water. It's a commodity utility operation. Perhaps the challenge is to take those former vertically integrated, vertically bundled companies, and instead of spending large amounts of money building infrastructure that consumers actually neither want nor value, the real thing is to actually go, maybe we should just become a commodity utility company and stop yearning for mythical dollars that simply aren't there.
That seems so much less attractive than expanding into new markets.
Well, obviously it's less attractive, but, that's really the pressures that are going on in the industry.
Okay. I really do want to go to the floor, but everybody's waving at me. David and Milton, just very briefly, please, and then we'll go to the floor.
Well, thank you very much, and I'll be very brief. I want to, of course, associate myself with the terrific comments that Rohan made. I think that's very much along the lines of our thinking as well. I think in terms of one of the points that I certainly agree with that Luigi made is the importance of WICIT and the importance of having a outcome that all can agree with. A classic ITU win-win is certainly what we want, and we are tremendously heartened by the extraordinary capacities of our chairman, at Wicket. He will, have known him for many years. He's extraordinarily effective and good, and we will be in his hands to make sure in this very brief conference that we'll be in very good shape. So it gives me great encouragement. One of the points, there are sort of two additional points I think are very important to be made with regard to what Luigi was saying. In the claim, which I can certainly understand, that there is no attempt to try to have new regulations, nevertheless, this is the International Telecommunications Regulations. It is a treaty. It involves rights. When there are rights being provided, I can't speak about the Italian Constitution, but in all the legal agreements that I know, when there are rights given, there needs to be a dispute mechanism for enforcement of rights as a matter of course. And whether that dispute resolution mechanism is domestic courts or the ITU, which has never been involved in such matters before, I think it would be an extraordinary and very dangerous precedent for all of us, not only in this area, but in areas generally. And because we're about to go to the floor, let me point out before we leave that there is a very important issue related to all of this that goes right to the internet-related issues, which are proposals that I think are ICANN related that have now been made. For example, one of the proposals made by one of the regional groups says, among other things, that member states shall, if they so elect, be able to control all naming, numbering, addressing, and identification resources used within their territories for international telecommunications / ICT services. So in terms of internet-related issues that are, of course, great interest here, another piece that is going to be the subject of active discussions and negotiations in Dubai. Thank you.
That sounds like a proposal likely to win great consensus in Dubai. Just very briefly, Milton, and then let's go to the floor.
Okay, I hope my standard of briefness is not the same as Ambassador Gross's. I just wanted to say that I don't want telecom companies to become commodity utilities. I think it's essential for the dynamism of the internet market that network operators continue to innovate and to seek new services. Of course, they're not going to do that by going backwards towards telecom or telephone-based pricing structures, but there is in the U.S. in the mobile sphere a repricing of bandwidth that's going on, attendant upon the transition from dominance of voice to dominance of data, and I think that the companies need to look at that kind of repricing that as the source of the solution to their problems, and that if regulatory systems in the EU or in specific nations impede that repricing, then that's what the companies need to be looking at.
So you shouldn't get regulatory relief through an international treaty, is what you're suggesting? Let's go to the floor real quick. Chris, did you have something you wanted to say before we...
Are there people on... Can you hear me? Are there people out there who want to make some comments? Because if you are, come up to the microphones. But I have a question for you. How many people in this room are going to be at Wicket? Because it's a real shame that this sort of discussion can't happen at Wicket, and you might want to tell all the people at Wicket how much of a shame it is that we can't have this sort of discussion at Wicket. Taking that message would be great. Gentlemen.
Wicket, actually, I'd like to call... We have the chairman of the Wicket here, and I wonder... He was in our workshop yesterday, and we discussed the question of public participation and so on and other matters. I think it would be appropriate. Would you like to say anything before we, and then I'll come to you? You have to, unfortunately, I'm sorry, you have to go back to the mic. Is it the mic on? The mic is not on again? Could you just press the button? Press the button. The plastic. Okay.
Now, okay. What I said yesterday is that every country has got its own accreditation process, and its own also consultation process that goes all the way until they submit their common proposal to the regional groups, and then the regional groups, they get together and discuss this in a multilateral form and reach their consensus in terms of their proposals, and then the regional groups get together and start negotiating on the proposals. Now, I just want to highlight something. every party, and I'm not talking about governments right now, every party has got an interest. So you have the telcos has got an interest, we have OTTs has got an interest, we have the civil societies and the people who has concern over the future and the innovation of that happened for the internet has also got interest that they want to continue having that. And believe it or not, with my experience over the history of all these treaty conferences that I participated in, we come together with a lot of polarized positions, and at the end of the conference we get to a fantastic text that is agreed by all parties, and everybody goes happily after that, and countries ratify those treaties. And we have seen that over and over and over and over again, and I am hopeful that the Dubai Treaty on WICID will be one of those treaties. I just wanted to encourage one thing, is that governments should engage all their stakeholders in their deliberations and their submissions and for what they have as a position in order to engage everybody in this process. We as a country, we have engaged everybody in the process, and I'm sure that, and I'm talking now on behalf of the UAE, we have done that, and I'm hopeful that others do the same. But we should not leave the momentum of the spirit of cooperation. We should not just say something and stick to it. We need to sit together and discuss that and understand the other position, and be open to discussion to reach to a consensus and reach to an agreement, and that's where everybody wins. And this is the spirit that we will go into the conference, having all the regional groups get together, or even all countries get together and discuss it on a consensus manner without bias to anybody. So that's the philosophy that we've been working on the past months in order to reach to a successful conclusion on WICID. And I will be happy to get any question that you guys have. I cannot comment on any of these specific. I would love to, but I would not speak as a chairman of the conference. I would speak as an administration, and this is not something that I want to do now. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Mr. Chairman. Okay, yes, please. We have 5 minutes, and so let's just take quickly. If there's, inevitably with the CIR main sessions, we try to cover a lot. We knew we might not get to the last bit on enhanced cooperation with a big panel, but that's fine. But we would like to get as many statements from the floor as possible. If there are people who have any concerns, please get up behind the mic. We'll take them all quickly, and then we'll do a response from whomever. Yes, yeah. Go ahead, please.
Hisham Ibrahim, Afrinac. My question to Luigi would be about the Ethno proposal. It just stands reason that mature telecos will probably be charging less than developing telecos. So what guarantees would I have from a developing region that my traffic won't be routed half across the world to when content starts selecting which market it pushes its traffic through to get me, and I find my traffic gets bounced all around. My second comment really quick is about the meeting here. Actually, a lot of people are complaining they can't get on the internet because IPv4 in the meeting has run out. Doesn't it stand logic that we implement IPv6 here so that we get more addresses so that people can get connected? Thank you.
Okay, yes, please go ahead.
My name is Walter Natris. I'm a private consultant and moderated session 87 yesterday on enhanced cooperation. Because we can't discuss it in a very large way, I try to sum it up very quickly. What we basically discussed is that everybody has to get out of their silos. So we had governments, we had industry, we had regulators, we had etc., CERTs, international bodies, and everybody always talks in their own private silo, except at the IGF apparently, so maybe it's an idea to do that more often so that people actually have more interaction, learn what their actual problems, but also their actual knowledge is, that an experience that they bring, and influence each other's thinking that way. And I think the IGF once a year is a great event, but maybe it should happen more often at different sort of conferences where usually everybody sits in their own little world. And that was the main conclusion yesterday, where everybody agreed upon. And certainly no world treaty for the internet. We had 8.5 out of 9 points there. So,
Okay, thank you very much. Are there no other questions? Everybody's thinking about lunch. Is that that's fine? Then we have one more is coming up to the mic, I think, and then we will get to closing thoughts.
Hi, Michael Kendi with Analysis Mason. Another question for Luigi. You've talked a lot about sustainability of the internet and how what's going to happen in Europe might happen elsewhere. But I'm wondering, the only number you've given really, and of definition, is that you're spending $44 billion in investment, which is divided between voice services, internet, European obligations. So I'm wondering, how do you quantify this? I mean, and how much do you think you can raise if this works out? How much money would come out of it? I mean, are you thinking that you'll be able to cover all your investments, half? So if you can just get a little more specific, what do you mean by sustainability? What is the problem that could come in other parts of the world that follows from this?
Thank you very much. Okay, so Luigi, you seem to have attracted a lot of attention today.
Yes. Okay.
So if you'd like to...
if I may, I will start from the last question that is very interesting because it comes from a consultant and they should know these things, but it's good that he has addressed such kind of issue. What we meant for sustainability of the internet. Basically, there are two things to consider. First are the revenue, and second are the cost investment. What is happening, and if you want, I can give you all the numbers, and I think you should have, by the way, that numbers. That, for example, in Europe, and this started to happen also outside Europe. This will be the fourth year that the telecom operators are losing revenue, between 2 and 3%. On the other hand, you have, imagine you have the data on the boom of the traffic. I think you should have that, but we can discuss how much the traffic is growing, is booming, and what does it mean? In order to the investment that they are needed on today network. Then we have to guarantee investment for the new networks like LTE, fiber, and you know that the level of our investment in infrastructure is a certain percentage of our revenue, which is about 15%. So we invest about 15% of our total revenue are invested for infrastructure. If we reduce the level of revenue, we will reduce the level of investment. Okay. So this is, I think, extremely easy to understand, and we believe that this system, how it is now, does not work. And I agree with Milton Muller, what he was saying before, that started to happen that several operators in other regions of the world are repricing, is nicely in this wording, repricing their offer.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you, Luigi. Let me hand it back to the chairman to close the session.
Thank you very much, dear moderators and the panelists. Thanks to you, today we have a very open discussion on important issues which we are interest for all of us. First of all, regarding TLD, generic TLD domain operated by ICANN, we should be with this. We know that it's from one point we would like to provide a transparent and open, a fast way to just obtain these generic TDL domains. But from another hand, we should be very careful with the privatization and bringing it to the open market to avoid any time of any speculations. Another thing is the role of the government and the rights to objective of the government. Regarding that IPv6, IPv4, we all know that it's scarcity of the IPv6 resources, but we know that it's quite complicated to support, and it's required a lot of investment from the operator, from the market, to support both IPv6 and IPv4. From another point of view, we just heard from our panelists that really that 1/3 of IPv6 resources is still available available. So the question is how to, let's say, to give it to the who need it. Yeah, and also that thanks for this open discussion. I think being more closer to Dubai event, I think this very active discussion will help us and helped us to come to consensus on Dubai event. So that I would like again with these comments conclude this section of critical internet resources. And again, thank you for excellent moderating, and thank you for all participants, all the participants, and valuable discussion. I call the session closed and pass the microphone Mr. Massano of the IGF Secretariat.
Thank you very much, Chair. No housekeeping notices. We resume at 3 o'clock. Thank you very much. Have a good lunch. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Well, I don't know what he was fixing on the thing, but it's on now.